My daughter sold my late wife's Rolex, the only thing I had left of her, to fund a luxury vacation. Stop whining, she said. I needed the money. But when I called the pawn shop to beg for it back, the owner's voice was low and urgent. You need to come down here, sir, he said. You need to see what your wife hid inside the watch. My daughter thought she had sold a $5,000 timepiece. She had no idea she had just sold the $100 million secret that our entire family fortune was built on. Before I continue, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit that like and subscribe button if you believe that some things are more valuable than their price tag. My name is Elias Vance. I am 75 years old, and for the last 6 months my world has been a place of profound and unending silence. The silence of a house that was once filled with the brilliant, infectious laughter of my wife, Lena. Now the only sound is the quiet, rhythmic ticking of the clocks. I spend my days in my workshop, a small, clean, and orderly space behind the house. It is a room of tiny, precise tools, of magnifying lenses, and of beautiful, intricate machines. I am by trade a micro-mechanical engineer, a watchmaker of a sort. I spent my life designing the microscopic gears and springs that power everything from medical devices to aerospace guidance systems. My Lena was the one who took my tiny, intricate inventions and built an empire around them. She was the CEO. I was just the quiet man in the workshop, the ghost in her machine. Today, I was not building anything new. I was performing a ritual, a communion. On the green felt of my workbench, under the bright, clean light of a magnifying lamp, lay her watch. It was a Rolex Lady Date, just a simple, elegant piece of steel and gold from the 1980s. It was not the flashiest watch she owned, but it was the one she wore every day. It was her tool, her constant companion. To anyone else, it was just a piece of jewelry. But to me, it was a miracle of engineering. A perfect, self-winding mechanical ecosystem with a heartbeat of 8 ticks per second. I was cleaning it, a slow, meticulous process. I unscrewed the back with a special tool, exposing the tiny, glittering universe of gears and jewels within. The balance wheel, the heart of the watch, was still oscillating, a faithful, tiny heartbeat that had outlasted her own. I would do this once a month. I would clean the case, check the seals, regulate the timing. It was not a task. It was a conversation. It was the only way I had left to connect with her, to touch something that had been a part of her daily life, something that had rested against her skin, that had ticked away the seconds of our 50 years together. This watch was more than a memory. It was a testament to our partnership. She was the brilliant, unstoppable force that moved through the world. I was the quiet, precise, and utterly reliable mechanism that powered her. This watch was us, a beautiful machine working in perfect harmony. I finished my work and carefully screwed the backplate on, tightening it to the exact torque required to ensure its water resistance. I wound the crown, the tiny clicks, a satisfying tactile sound. I held it to my ear, listening to its quiet, steady heartbeat. In the crushing silence of my life, it was the most beautiful sound in the world, and I had no idea it was the last time I would ever hear it. The peace I had cultivated in my workshop was a fragile thing. It was shattered that afternoon by the sound of a car engine, a sound that was too loud, too aggressive for my quiet suburban street. I looked through the window and saw a bright red, ostentatious sports car, a machine designed for speed and attention, parked in my driveway. It was my son-in-law, Chad. He unfolded himself from the driver's seat, a tall, handsome man in a polo shirt that was a little too tight and sunglasses that were a little too large. My daughter Serena got out of the passenger side. She looked tired, I thought a little worn around the edges, as if she were constantly trying to keep up with the frantic, exhausting energy of the man she had married. They came into the workshop without knocking. Chad was all booming false bonhomie, a whirlwind of manufactured charm. "Eli, my man," he said, clapping me on the shoulder a little too hard. "Still hiding out in here with your tiny toys, I see." He called my life's work, my passion, tiny toys. It was his way of asserting his own superiority, of diminishing a world he did not understand. Serena gave me a quick, dutiful kiss on the cheek. "Hi, Daddy," she said, her eyes already darting around the workshop, looking for a place to put her purse, a place that was clean. "We were just in the neighborhood," she said, a lie I knew was a lie. They were never just in the neighborhood. Their visits were always surgical strikes missions with a specific, usually financial objective. Chad began to pace the small space, picking up my delicate tools, looking at them with a kind of bored anthropological curiosity, as if he were in a museum of a dead and irrelevant culture. "So, He began getting straight to the point. Serena and I have the most incredible opportunity. A friend of mine has a villa in Bali, a real palace, private beach staff, the whole 9 yards. And he's giving it to us for the whole month of August for next to nothing. It's a once-in-a-lifetime trip, Eli. We deserve it. We've been working so hard. Working. I had never seen Chad do a day of real work in his life. He was a venture investor, which as far as I could tell meant he used other people's money to make a series of loud, unsuccessful bets on fleeting trends. The only problem, he continued, finally settling his gaze on the workbench on the object of my morning's devotion, is cash flow. We're a little tight right now. All our capital is tied up in a new crypto venture that's about to pop. His eyes fixed on Lena's Rolex, which was gleaming under the bright light of my lamp. I saw something shift in his expression. The bored curiosity was gone, replaced by a quick, sharp, and utterly cold calculation. He was not seeing a beautiful machine. He was not seeing a 50-year-old love story. He was seeing a price tag. "Wow," he said, stepping closer, his voice a low, appreciative purr. "That's a pretty little thing, isn't it? What is that, an 80s model? What's something like that worth these days? 5 grand, 6. He was appraising my wife's memory as if it were a piece of used furniture at a garage sale. Serena looked uncomfortable. "Chad, don't," she said, her voice a low warning, but he ignored her. He was a shark who had scented blood in the water. "You know, Eli," he said, picking up a pair of my finest tweezers and examining them, "you're sitting on a lot of assets in this house, a lot of old things just collecting dust. Sometimes you have to liquidate the past to finance the future. It's just smart business." The threat was no longer veiled. It was a direct, brutal proposition. He saw my grief, my love, my memories not as a part of my soul, but as an underperforming asset class. And he was here today in my sanctuary to suggest in the kindest, most reasonable way possible a corporate restructuring of my heart. The veiled threat from my son-in-law hung in the air of my workshop for days, a toxic, invisible gas. I tried to dismiss it as the idle, arrogant talk of a man I did not respect. I told myself that my daughter Serena would never allow it, that she understood the sentimental, the sacred value of her mother's watch. I told myself that there were still lines that would not be crossed. I was a fool. 3 days later, I went to the small, felt-lined drawer in my workbench where I kept the Rolex when I was not cleaning it. It was its home, its safe harbor. I reached in my fingers, expecting to feel the cool, familiar weight of the steel and gold. They felt nothing but the soft, empty felt. A small, cold knot of unease formed in my stomach. I was a meticulous man. I did not misplace things. I emptied the drawer. Nothing. I began to search the workshop, my movements at first calm and methodical, then growing more frantic. I checked every drawer, every shelf, every possible place I might have put it. It was not there. The unease was beginning to curdle into a cold, creeping dread. I went into the house. I searched my bedroom, the nightstand, the top of the dresser where I sometimes left my own watch. Nothing. I looked in the study in the living room. The panic was a physical thing now, a tightness in my chest, a frantic, buzzing energy behind my eyes. It was not just a watch. It was her. It was the last tangible piece of her I had left in the world, and it was gone. My hands were trembling as I dialed Serena's number. She answered on the 4th ring, her voice a little breathless, a little annoyed. "Dad, I'm in the middle of something. What is it?" "The watch, Serena." I said, my voice a dry, rasping thing I did not recognize. "Your mother's watch. It's gone. I can't find it anywhere. I think someone might have broken in." The silence on the other end of the line was not the silence of shock or concern. It was a heavy, cold, and deeply guilty silence. "Serena?" I asked, a terrible, horrifying suspicion beginning to dawn in my mind. Did you move it?" When she finally spoke, her voice was not the voice of my daughter. It was the voice of a stranger, a cold, impatient, and utterly ruthless stranger. "Oh, for God's sake, Dad, stop whining," she said, her tone a weary, dismissive sigh. "It's not gone. It's sold." The words did not compute. My brain simply could not process them. "Sold?" I repeated the word, a stupid, empty sound. "What are you talking about?" "I needed the money for the trip to Bali," she said, her voice a flat, unapologetic statement of fact. Chad got us an incredible deal, but we had to put down a non-refundable deposit. The watch covered it. It was just sitting there collecting dust. It's better this way. At least it's being used for something. I could not breathe. The air in my lungs had turned to glass. She had sold her mother's soul for a deposit on a vacation. And then she delivered the final killing blow, the words that would echo in the silence of my life forever. "Mom's dead anyway," she said, her voice a cold, pragmatic shrug. "She's not using it." I stood in the middle of my quiet, empty house, the phone pressed to my ear, and I felt the last fragile foundation of my world crumble to dust. She was not just my daughter, she was a grave robber, and the grave she had just desecrated was my own heart. The phone was a dead weight in my hand. I don't know how long I stood there after she hung up, listening to the dial tone, a sound of absolute final disconnection. Her words, "Mom's dead anyway, she's not using it," echoed in the silent house. They were not just cruel words. They were a philosophical statement, a declaration that the past had no value, that memory had no currency, that the only thing that mattered was the immediate selfish and transactional present. I finally placed the phone back in its cradle, my movements slow, stiff, the movements of an old man. The house which had been my sanctuary now felt like a tomb, a place of ghosts and stolen things. I was still standing in the middle of the living room when they walked back in. They had their coats on. They were ready to leave. Serena's face was a mask of cold, impatient resolve. She was a woman who had just closed a difficult but necessary business deal, and she was eager to move on to the next item on her agenda. She saw the look on my face, the profound, bottomless shock, and she sighed, a sound of pure, unadulterated annoyance. She reached into her expensive handbag and pulled something out. It was a small, glossy piece of cardboard, a business card. "Here," she said, holding it out to me. "This is where I sold it, Abe's Timepieces. It's a respectable place. They gave me a fair price." I did not take the card. My hands felt like they were made of lead. I just stared at it, at this cheap, transactional piece of paper that was supposed to be a consolation prize for the theft of my wife's soul. Chad, ever the problem solver, stepped forward. "See, Eli, it's not a big deal," he said with a cheerful, booming voice that was a physical assault in the quiet room. "She even got you the address. Problem solved." Serena, seeing that I would not take the card, simply placed it on the small table by the door. Then she delivered the final, most devastating blow of all. She looked at me, not with hatred, not with anger, but with a kind of weary, clinical detachment, as if I were a difficult child who simply refused to understand a simple instruction. "If you want it back so badly, Dad," she said, her voice a flat, empty thing, "you can go buy it yourself." And then they turned and walked out the door. They did not say goodbye. They did not say they loved me. They simply left their footsteps light and unburdened on the porch steps. A moment later, I heard the roar of Chad's sports car as it started up, a loud, violent, and triumphant sound. It was the sound of them speeding away to their new, brighter, and more luxurious future, a future financed by the sale of my past. I stood in the silent house for a long, long time. The only sound was the quiet, relentless ticking of the clocks in my workshop. I looked at the empty space on the mantel where her picture should have been, a space that was now just a void. The betrayal was complete. It was not just a theft. It was an erasure. They had not just taken a thing from me. They had taken her from me all over again. And I was utterly, completely, and finally alone. After they left, the house was a vacuum. The quiet they had left behind was not a peaceful one. It was a dead, heavy, and profound silence, the sound of a theft. I walked through the rooms, a ghost in my own life, my hand trailing over the furniture, the books, the objects that had until this afternoon formed the geography of my world. Now they were just things, soulless. Their meaning had been stolen along with the watch. I ended up in my study, the small room off the living room where I kept a lifetime of memories. On the wall was a photograph of Lena, my Lena, the one I kept separate from all the others. It was from the early days of the company, taken the day we signed our first major contract, a deal that took us from a garage-based startup to a real viable business. In the photo, she isn't wearing a business suit. She's in a simple dress, her hair a little messy, her face alight with a mixture of terror and triumphant joy. And on her wrist is the Rolex. I remember that day as if it were yesterday. We had just come from the signing. We were both giddy, terrified, and drunk on the possibilities of the future. I had been saving for months a secret from her. I took the small green box out of my pocket. When she opened it, she was silent for a long, long time. She just looked at it, at the simple, elegant circle of steel and gold. "Oh, Eli," she had whispered, her voice full of an awe that had nothing to do with the price tag. I had helped her put it on her wrist. It looked so perfect there, a beautiful, precise machine on the wrist of the most brilliant, unstoppable woman I had ever known. "It's not a piece of jewelry, Eli," she had said, turning her wrist, watching the second hand sweep in a perfect silent circle. Her words came back to me now, a clear, sharp echo in the silence of my study. "It's a promise." I hadn't understood at first. I thought she was just being poetic. "A promise?" I had asked. "Yes," she had said, and she looked at me with those eyes that could see right through to the gears and springs of my own soul. "It's a promise that we will always, always respect a beautiful machine that works perfectly. It's a promise that we will never forget that our success is built not on flash, not on sales pitches, but on the quiet, perfect, and relentless integrity of the work itself." She had understood me. She had understood my world, the world of tiny, perfect, and honest machines. And she had taken that world and she had translated it into a promise, a philosophy, a creed that we would build our empire upon. The watch was not a reward for our success. It was a symbol of the principles that had created it. It was our Constitution rendered in steel and gold. My daughter Serena had never heard that story. She had seen the Rolex on her mother's wrist 1,000 times, but she had only ever seen the gold. She had never seen the promise. She had looked at a sacred text and had seen only the value of the paper it was printed on. And she had sold it for a vacation. I looked at the photograph of my wife, at her young, joyful, determined face, and a new feeling, a feeling colder and harder than grief, began to form in my heart. My daughter had not just sold a watch. She had broken a promise. She had violated the founding principle of our entire legacy. And I knew with a certainty that was as cold and precise as the ticking of a Rolex that there had to be a consequence. It was not a matter of revenge. It was a matter of restoring the integrity of the machine. My daughter's words, "You can go buy it yourself," were meant to be the final dismissive insult, a casual, cruel display of her power and my impotence. But she had made a critical mistake. She had given me a piece of information. She had given me a name, a destination, a target. After standing in the silence for what felt like an eternity, I walked over to the small table by the door. I picked up the business card she had left. It was thick, expensive cardstock with elegant embossed lettering. "Abe's Timepieces," it read. "Fine watches and expert repair." And an address downtown. It was not the kind of place you'd go to sell a stolen television. It was a place for specialists. My first impulse was to drive there immediately, to throw myself at the mercy of this Mr. Abe, to beg, to plead. But the CEO in me, the cold, calculating strategist who was now fully in command, rejected that idea. Emotion was a weak, negotiating position. I needed to approach this as a business problem. I needed data. I took the card to my study and sat down at my desk. I looked up the number, and with a hand that was surprisingly steady, I dialed. An older gentleman with a slight European-sounding accent answered on the second ring. "Abe's Timepieces, Abe speaking." His voice was quiet, professional, the voice of a man who is used to dealing with valuable things. "Good afternoon." I began, my own voice calm, measured. "My name is Elias Vance. I believe my daughter was in your shop earlier today. Serena Sterling. She sold you a watch, a vintage Rolex Lady, date just." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint, gentle ticking of 100 different clocks in the background. "Ah, yes," he said, his voice cautious. "A beautiful piece. A classic. Very well maintained." "That watch," I said, my voice catching slightly, "was my late wife's. It has a great deal of sentimental value. My daughter, she made a mistake. I would like to buy it back." I waited, my heart pounding in my chest. This was it. The moment of truth. The man on the other end of the line, this Mr. Abe, was silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was kind but also firm. The voice of a man who has run an honest business for a long, long time. "Mr. Vance," he said, and I could hear the genuine sympathy in his voice. "I am truly sorry for your loss and for this situation, but your daughter is a grown woman. She came to me with a valid ID. She signed a legally binding bill of sale attesting that she was the rightful owner of the property. The transaction was clean, legal, and fair. I gave her a very good price for that watch, sir." I felt the hope begin to drain out of me. "But I'll pay you more," I said, my voice desperate. "Whatever you paid her plus a profit for your time, please. You don't understand what this watch means to me." "I am a watchmaker, Mr. Vance," he replied softly. "I understand what a fine timepiece can mean, but I am also a businessman. I have rules, procedures. The sale was legal. I cannot simply reverse it. My reputation is built on discretion and integrity." It was over. I had lost. He was a man of principle, and I could not fault him for it. I was about to thank him for his time and hang up to surrender to this final devastating loss. "However," he said, his voice dropping slightly, a new curious tone in it, "I have to be honest with you, this is a most unusual situation." The hope, a tiny foolish flicker, returned. "Unusual how?" I asked. "I'm in the process of servicing the watch for its new owner," he explained. "A standard clean oil and regulation, and in all my 40 years of working on these beautiful machines, I have never seen anything like it." "Sir," he said, his voice now a low, urgent murmur, "you need to see what we found inside the watch." I was about to thank him for his time and hang up the phone to surrender to this final, devastating loss. My last hope, a desperate, foolish appeal to a stranger's kindness, had been extinguished by the simple, unyielding logic of a good businessman. The watch was gone. The story was over. "However," he said, and the word dropped into the silence of my defeat was like a single unexpected note in a quiet room. His voice had changed. The professional, regretful tone was gone, replaced by something else. A low, urgent murmur, a sound of genuine professional curiosity. "I have to be honest with you, Mr. Vance," he continued. "This is a most unusual situation." I held my breath. A tiny, foolish flicker of hope, a hope I thought had been extinguished forever, was rekindled. "Unusual how?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "As I said, I'm servicing the watch for its new owner," he explained. "A standard clean oil and regulation before he takes possession. It's a beautiful movement, a caliber 2135, reliable, a real workhorse. I've worked on hundreds of them in my career. I know this machine like the back of my own hand. I was a watchmaker. He was speaking my language, the language of machines. "I had the back open on my bench this afternoon," he went on, his voice dropping even lower, "and I was examining the balance wheel under the loupe, and I saw something that does not belong. I was silent, my mind racing. A flaw, a manufacturing defect. It was unlikely in a Rolex of that vintage, but not impossible." "What was it?" I asked, my own professional curiosity now piqued. "It's a mark," he said. "An engraving. But it's not a standard Rolex marking. It's not a service mark from another watchmaker. It is a micro-engraving on the surface of the balance wheel itself. It's so small, so precise, I almost missed it. It's not something that can be done with a standard tool. This was done with a laser or something I've never seen before. It is the work of a master, Mr. Vance, a true master." A cold electric shock went through me. Micro-engraving, a laser. I knew that technology. I had helped to invent it. "What does it say?" I asked, my voice now a raw, urgent whisper. There was a pause on the other end of the line. I could hear him take a deep, hesitant breath. "That," he said, "is why I am glad you called. It's a series of numbers and letters. It looks almost like a patent number, but I can't be sure. It's not my place to say more over the phone, but in all my 40 years of working on these beautiful machines, I have never seen anything like it." He paused again, and then he made his offer, the offer that would change everything. "The new owner is not due to pick it up until the end of the week," he said, his voice a low, confidential murmur. "Sir, I am not a man who breaks the rules of his business, but I am a craftsman, and what I have seen inside this watch, it is a matter of professional integrity. Mr. Vance. He said, his voice now a firm, direct invitation. You need to come to my shop. You need to see this for yourself. I hung up the phone. The grief was still there, a great gaping wound in my soul, but it was no longer the only thing. Beside it, a new feeling was beginning to grow, a cold, sharp, and powerfully familiar feeling, the feeling of a mystery, the feeling of a problem that needed to be solved. And for the first time in 6 months, I had a reason to leave the house. I had a destination. I had a mission. The drive downtown was a blur. I don't remember the traffic, the stoplights, the noise of the city. My world had shrunk to a single sharp point of focus, the address on the glossy business card. Abe's timepieces was not in one of the new, fashionable parts of the city. It was on a quiet old street nestled between a dusty bookstore and a tailor's shop. The storefront was not a vast expanse of modern glass. It was a small dark wood-framed window displaying a few carefully chosen vintage watches on velvet stands. It was a place out of time, a relic from an era when craftsmanship was valued more than branding. I pushed open the heavy wooden door and a small mechanical bell chimed softly, a delicate melodic sound. I stepped inside and into another world. The shop was a sanctuary of sound and motion. The air was filled not with silence but with the gentle, rhythmic, and perfectly synchronized ticking of hundreds of clocks. Grandfather clocks stood like silent, wise sentinels along one wall, their long pendulums swinging in a slow, hypnotic rhythm. Glass display cases were filled with watches of every description, their tiny second hands sweeping in a constant silent dance. The air smelled of old wood brass polish and the clean metallic scent of lubricating oil. It was the smell of my own workshop, the smell of my own life. It was the most comforting scent in the world. From behind a large wooden workbench in the back of the shop, a man looked up. He was older than me, perhaps 70, with a kind, deeply lined face and a small, neat gray beard. He wore a simple leather apron over a crisp white shirt, and perched on his forehead was a jeweler's loop, the third eye of a watchmaker. "Mr. Vance?" He asked, his voice the same quiet, respectful tone from the phone. "I am Abe Cohen. Thank you for coming." He wiped his hands on a clean rag and came around the counter to shake my hand. His grip, like mine, was the firm, steady grip of a man who works with his hands. His eyes were a startlingly clear blue, magnified slightly by his reading glasses, and they were filled with a deep, intelligent curiosity. He was not a pawnbroker. He was a craftsman, a fellow member of the guild. We understood each other without having to speak. "Thank you for calling me Mr. Abe," I said, my voice a little shaky. "The watch." "Of course," he said, and he led me back to his workbench. It was a beautiful, organized chaos, a landscape of tiny tools, delicate instruments, and the disassembled entrails of a dozen different timepieces. And there, in the center of it all, under the bright, focused beam of a workbench lamp, lay the heart of my wife, the Rolex. It was not on display. It was in the middle of surgery. The case back was off, and the movement, the tiny, intricate engine, was exposed. It was a sight that was both deeply familiar and profoundly shocking. Abe picked up his loop and settled it over his eye. "Please," he said, gesturing to a stool beside him. "You are the engineer. You must see this for yourself. I have never in all my years seen such a thing." I took the stool beside him, my heart a frantic, irregular beat in my chest. He handed me his own jeweler's loop, a heavy, well-used piece of brass and glass. It felt familiar in my hand. I fitted it to my eye, and the world outside the small circle of its lens disappeared. All that existed was the beautiful, intricate, and now deeply mysterious world inside my wife's watch. The movement was a tiny, glittering city of gears, springs, and ruby jewels. It was a caliber 2135, a design I knew as well as my own face, a masterpiece of Swiss engineering, reliable, robust, perfect. Abe, seeing that I was settled, reached into this miniature city with a pair of impossibly fine tweezers. He moved with the steady, practiced grace of a surgeon. "Look here," he said, his voice a low murmur. "The escapement is fine, the mainspring is perfect, but the balance wheel—" His tweezers gently nudged a small, rapidly oscillating wheel, the very heart of the watch. "Every Rolex has a serial number on the movement," he explained, his voice the quiet, patient tone of a professor. "A unique identifier, but this is something else." He adjusted the angle of the light, and I saw it. On the flat, polished surface of the balance wheel, a surface no bigger than my smallest fingernail, was a mark. It was a series of characters so infinitesimally small they were almost invisible, a ghost on the machine. "That's not a serial number," I whispered, my own voice a stranger's in my ears. "A serial number is stamped. It has a physical depth. It's etched, burned into the surface." "Exactly," Abe said, his voice full of a craftsman's respect. "It's a micro-engraving. I've worked on military-grade chronometers on watches with complications that would make your head spin. But I have never seen a mark this small, this precise on a commercial timepiece. It is not factory work. This was done by a master, a specialist. It is so small, so perfectly placed, that it doesn't even affect the balance of the wheel. It's functionally invisible. If I hadn't been doing a full teardown for the service, no one would have ever found it." I stared at the tiny secret message, a message that had been ticking away on my wife's wrist for 30 years, a message that had been hidden in plain sight. My mind, the mind of the engineer, was racing. I knew the technology required to make a mark like that. There were perhaps 5 or 6 machines in the country in the 1980s that could have done it, and one of them had been in my own lab. A sudden impossible and electrifying idea began to form in my mind, a connection so profound it made the hairs on my arms stand up. "What does it say?" I asked, my voice a raw, urgent whisper. "Can you read it?" Abe adjusted his own loop. "It's a sequence," he said. "Letters and numbers. It looks like US PAT, and then a series of numbers." He read them out one by one, and with each number the world seemed to slow down, the hundreds of ticking clocks in the small shop fading into a single deafening roar in my own ears. It was not a random sequence. It was a code, and it was the combination to a vault I had forgotten I had even built. Abe adjusted his own loop, his breath fogging the small lens for a second. He wiped it clean with a cloth and leaned in again, his entire world shrinking to the tiny, oscillating wheel inside the Rolex. "It's a sequence," he said, his voice a low, concentrated murmur. "Letters and numbers. It starts US PAT, and then a series of digits. 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. He read them out loud, a simple recitation of a number that meant nothing to him. But to me it was not a number. It was a key. It was a lightning strike. It was the sound of a vault door rusted shut for decades in the back of my mind, groaning open. US PAT 5, 123, 456. The blood pounded in my ears. The hundreds of ticking clocks in the small shop seemed to fade into a single deafening roar. I felt a wave of dizziness, a sense of temporal vertigo as the quiet, dusty pawn shop dissolved around me and I was transported back 35 years to a moment of pure, unadulterated creation. I was a young man again, standing in my garage, the air thick with the smell of solder and ozone. I was looking at a schematic I had drawn by hand, a design so radical, so impossible that no one believed it could work. It was a new type of micro-actuator, a gear system smaller than a grain of salt that could move with a precision that was at the time thought to be physically impossible. It was my first great invention, my masterpiece. It was the invention that had launched our company Viridian Dynamics. It was the foundation upon which our entire $42 million empire was built, and US Patent 5, 123, 456 was its birth certificate. I remembered the day the patent was officially granted. I had come home waving the certificate in the air, and Lena had opened a bottle of cheap champagne. We had danced in our small living room, drunk on the future. I had no idea that Lena, my brilliant, sentimental, and fiercely protective Lena, had commemorated that day, had memorialized our victory with a secret message etched by a laser onto the beating heart of the watch she would wear for the rest of her life. It was a message, a secret she had kept for 30 years, a message to me from her, a reminder. The secret message said, is the foundation. This is where it all began. Never forget. And I had. In the noise of success, in the daily grind of running a massive company, I had forgotten the quiet, perfect beauty of that first impossible creation. But my daughter Serena in her greed and my son-in-law Chad in his arrogance had just unwittingly unearthed it. They thought they had sold a $5,000 piece of jewelry. They had no idea what they had actually done. They had taken the founding document of their own kingdom, the very deed to their inheritance, and sold it for a pittance to a quiet, observant old man in a dusty downtown shop. I lowered the loupe from my eye. My hand was trembling. The grief for my wife was still there, a great aching void. But it was no longer alone. Beside it, a new and terrible power was beginning to grow. A cold, clear, and perfectly calibrated sense of purpose. The game had just changed, and I finally, after all these years, understood the rules my wife had written. I left Abe's shop in a daze. The world outside the bustling city, the noise, the traffic, all of it seemed distant and unreal. My own world had just been fundamentally reordered. The patent number, US Pay T5 123456. It was a ghost, a message from a past I had almost forgotten. My daughter thought she had sold a watch. My wife had known she was leaving behind a key. My first instinct was to call my lawyer, to lay out the facts to begin the legal assault. But I stopped myself. That was Grant's way of thinking. The frontal assault, the lawyers and the threats. Lena's way was different. She was a strategist. She didn't just build walls, she built mazes. She left clues. The number on the watch was not the weapon itself. It was the first clue on a map she had left for me. And I knew with a certainty that was as deep and profound as my grief that she would have expected me to follow the map myself. This was not a legal problem yet. It was an engineering problem. A problem of reverse engineering my own life, my own legacy. Before I could bring in the lawyers, I needed to understand the full schematics of the trap my wife had built. And that meant I needed to find the original documents, the source code of our company. I drove not to my lawyer's office, but to a part of the city I hadn't visited in years. A quiet industrial area of anonymous-looking warehouses. My destination was a climate-controlled, high-security storage facility. A place where corporations store their archives, their old paper histories that are too important to destroy, but too cumbersome to keep. When Lena and I had sold the company, we had kept all of our personal founding documents, our original contracts, our first set of lab notes. We had stored them here in a small 10 by 10 room, a time capsule of our life's work. I stood before the heavy rolling steel door of our unit, Unit 4B. The simple functional lettering seemed so inadequate for the lifetime of struggle and triumph that was stored inside. I entered the code, a sequence of numbers only Lena and I knew, our anniversary, and the date the patent had been granted. The lock clicked open with a heavy, satisfying thud. I rolled the door up, and the air that greeted me was cool, dry, and smelled of old, important paper. The room was lined with shelves, and on those shelves were dozens of identical, neatly labeled archive boxes. Lab notes 1985-1988. Early investor correspondence. Vendor contracts. It was a library of our life. I felt a pang of profound sadness. This was all that was left of our partnership, a room full of paper. But, as I looked at the boxes, the sadness was replaced by a cold, rising excitement. The hunt had begun. I was not looking for a memory. I was looking for a contract. The one specific foundational document that I knew with an engineer's intuition that Lena would have tinkered with. The contract that bound my invention to her company. The contract that I was now beginning to suspect was the real legacy she had left me. The archive room was a silent testament to a life of relentless work. Box after box neatly labeled, chronicling the slow, difficult, and ultimately triumphant birth of Viridian dynamics. My hands, the hands of a watchmaker, moved with a quiet, practiced efficiency. I was not searching frantically. I was executing a diagnostic. I was looking for a single specific component in a complex 30-year-old machine. I passed over the boxes of lab notes, the years of failed experiments and painstaking research. I ignored the early investor correspondence, the letters full of skepticism and hope. I was looking for the legal architecture, the foundational documents that had turned my science into my wife's empire. The box was labeled simply, Founding Contracts and Agreements 1988 to 1990. My heart, which had been a quiet, steady rhythm, began to beat a little faster. This was it. I lifted the heavy box from the shelf and carried it to the small metal table in the center of the room. I sat down, the only sound the quiet hum of the climate control system. I opened the box. The smell of old important paper filled the small space. The files were organized with Lena's trademark, ruthless efficiency. Everything was in chronological order. I sifted through the early vendor contracts, the lease for our first real lab space, the employment agreements for our first 2 scientists. They were ghosts' memories rendered in the dry, formal language of the law. And then I found it. It was in a simple, unassuming manila folder. On the tab in Lena's elegant, sharp handwriting were the words, E. Vance, IP Licensing Agreement, US PAT 5 123456. My breath caught in my throat. I lifted the folder from the box as if it were a sacred artifact. I opened it. Inside was a single, surprisingly thin document held together by a single rusty staple, the Intellectual Property Licensing Agreement, the very first contract our company had ever made, the one between me, the inventor, and Viridian Dynamics, the company my wife had just incorporated. I remembered the day we signed it at our kitchen table. It had felt like a game of formality. I was giving my invention to our company, to our shared dream. The lawyer had drafted it a standard boilerplate agreement. I had barely read it. I had trusted Lena completely. I looked at the signature page. My own signature, a young man's confident scrawl, and hers the beautiful, powerful, and now heartbreakingly familiar signature of Lena Vance. This document, this simple, forgotten piece of paper, was the legal bridge between my mind and her empire. It was the contract that allowed her company to use my invention. It was the source code of our entire shared success. For 30 years, this document had lain dormant in a box, its power absolute but forgotten. My daughter and her husband had built their entire future on a mountain of wealth without ever once thinking to look at the single, simple contract that held the whole thing up. I began to read the dense, legalistic text not with the impatient eyes of the young man who had first signed it, but with the slow, meticulous, and intensely focused eyes of a watchmaker searching for a single, hidden, and impossibly important gear. I knew it had to be here. Lena never did anything without a reason, and the clue on the watch had led me directly to this room, to this box, to this exact piece of paper. The map was in my hands. All I had to do now was read it. I moved the single harsh lamp of the archive room closer, its light falling on the thin, brittle pages of the contract. The bulk of the document was standard legal text, a dense forest of whereases and herebys that I had ignored 30 years ago and was tempted to ignore now. But I was not the same man I was then. I was a watchmaker, a man trained to find the one small, crucial gear that makes the entire machine turn. I forced myself to read every word, every line. The first few pages were boilerplate. A standard intellectual property license. I, Elias Vance, the inventor, granted Viridian Dynamics, the company, an exclusive worldwide license to use, manufacture, and sell products based on my invention. Patent number 5123456. And then I got to Section 4, compensation. My eyes scanned the text, and I felt a small jolt of surprise. I had a vague memory of this, but seeing it in black and white was still a shock. The compensation for the license, the very patent that had generated billions of dollars in revenue for the company, was $1. $1 per year. It was a legal formality, a gesture of our partnership. My reward was not in a licensing fee. It was in my 50% ownership of the company itself. But it was the next section, Section 4B, that made me stop. It was a clause I did not remember at all. It was titled the Heritage Clause. The language was not the dry standard text of the rest of the contract. It was different. It was personal. I knew with a certainty that was as profound as grief that this was my wife's handwriting, her legal mind, and her fierce protective heart rendered in the language of the law. I read the words, and as I did, the ghost of my wife stood beside me in that cold, quiet room. In consideration for the nominal fee of $1 per annum, the clause began, this license is granted on the perpetual and non-negotiable condition that the tangible, symbolic, and sentimental artifacts of the founders Elias and Lena Vance shall be preserved and treated with the utmost respect by the company and by any and all subsequent heirs and assigns. My breath caught in my throat. It was a morality clause, an ethics clause embedded in the heart of a corporate contract. These artifacts, it continued, represent the foundational integrity and the personal history of the company's creation, and their preservation is considered a material component of this agreement. I scanned down the page, my heart pounding, and then I saw it. Appendix A referenced in the clause, a list of the symbolic artifacts defined in the contract. There were only 2 items on the list. The first was the original hand-drawn schematic for the patent, the one I had sketched on a napkin. The second item made the air leave my lungs in a single silent gasp. Item 2, the Rolex lady, date just watch, serial number R62XXXXX, presented by Elias Vance to Lena Vance upon the granting of the patent, symbolizing the promise of perfect, honest, and reliable mechanics. She had named it. She had legally defined her watch not as a piece of jewelry, but as a material component of the company's founding legal document. The sheer breathtaking brilliance of it was a masterpiece. She had foreseen a future where a person like Chad, a person who saw only the surface value of things, might enter our lives. And she had built a tripwire, a legal landmine, directly into the source code of our empire. The license, the very legal right for the company to exist, was contingent on respecting the one thing my daughter had just sold for the price of a vacation. I leaned back in the metal chair, the old contract trembling in my hands, and I laughed. It was the first time I had laughed in 6 months. It was the sound of a watchmaker who has just discovered a hidden, beautiful, and absolutely lethal complication in a machine he thought he knew. The trap was not just perfect, it was a work of art. The laughter that echoed in the cold, quiet archive room was a strange, rusty sound. It was the sound of a machine that hadn't been used in a long, long time. I leaned back in the flimsy metal chair, the old contract trembling in my hands, and I saw her. My Lena. Not the ghost in the photograph, but the living, breathing, fiercely intelligent woman who had stood beside me for 50 years. I saw her standing at our kitchen table 30 years ago, this very document spread out before her. And I remembered the conversation. I remembered why she had added the clause. It had been her idea, a strange last-minute addition that our lawyer had found odd, and that I had found a little bit paranoid. Serena was in college at the time, a bright, beautiful young woman who was, to my endless worry, beginning to show a preference for the flashier, more superficial things in life. She had just started dating a young man from a wealthy family, a man who drove a fast car and talked about money with an easy, casual arrogance. His name wasn't Chad, but he was a prototype, an early model of the man she would eventually marry. "I don't like him, Eli," Lena had said to me one evening after we had just had dinner with the two of them. "He looks at our daughter, but he doesn't see her. He sees her name. He sees the company." "She's just having fun, baby," I had said, trying to be the calm, reasonable father. "She'll grow out of it." "Will she?" Lena had replied, and her voice was quiet but with an edge of steel that I had learned to respect. "I hope so. But hope is not a business strategy, Eli, and our legacy is a business. We need to build in a safeguard." That was when she had first proposed the heritage clause. It was a strange, almost poetic piece of legal maneuvering. She wanted to tie the very license of our core patent, the engine of our entire company, to a list of sentimental objects. I had thought it was absurd. "You want to make a multi-million-dollar contract contingent on a watch and a napkin drawing?" I had asked, incredulous. "What if there's a fire? What if they get lost?" "They won't get lost," she had said, and her eyes had a far-off strategic look that I knew so well. It was the look she got just before she outmaneuvered a corporate rival. "They are the physical embodiment of our story. The napkin is the idea. The watch is the promise. They are the foundation." She had looked at me then, her expression softening, a deep maternal sadness in her eyes. "I'm not doing this to protect us, my love," she had said. "I'm doing this to protect her. I'm building a test into the very foundation of her inheritance. One day, a man like this one or another one just like him will come into her life. He will see her not as a partner, but as a prize. He will see our life's work not as a legacy to be built upon, but as a treasure chest to be looted, and he will have no respect for the things that truly matter. He will see the watch, and he will only see its price tag." And on that day, she had concluded, her voice a low, prophetic whisper. This clause will be a test of her character. Will she protect the foundation, or will she sell it for a quick profit? This clause isn't a wall, Eli. It's a mirror. It will force her and whoever she is with to show us who they truly are. I had thought she was being cynical, a little too protective. But she had seen the future. She had seen the fault line in our own daughter's character, her weakness for the shiny, empty promises of a man like Chad, and she had built this, her final, most brilliant, and most heartbreaking invention. The Rolex was not just a symbol, it was a legally binding litmus test, and my daughter, by selling it for a vacation, had just failed that test in the most spectacular and legally catastrophic way possible. I sat in the cold, silent archive, the laughter gone, replaced by a profound, chilling awe for the woman I had married. She had not just left me a memory, she had left me a roadmap, she had left me a weapon, and she had left me a final, heartbreaking lesson in the difference between price and value. I drove home from the archive facility in a state of profound electric calm. The grief was still there, a great quiet ocean inside me. But now there was a new current flowing through it, the cold, clear, and powerful current of my wife's final brilliant move. I had the map. I had the key. I had the weapon. Now, and only now, was it time to call the lawyer. I did not go to his office. A man in my position, a man who has just been evicted from his own home, does not project power by appearing hat in hand at a lawyer's firm. I called him from my study, from the room where the theft of my dignity had taken place, and I summoned him to me. He arrived within the hour, a tall, thin, and impeccably dressed man named Arthur Vance, a senior partner at the city's most respected corporate law firm. He was not a warm man, but he was a brilliant one, a legal architect of the highest order. He entered the house with a look of quiet, professional sympathy. "Elias," he said, shaking my hand, "I was so sorry to hear about Lena, and I was concerned when I heard you were no longer staying at the house." The news, I realized, had already begun to travel through the rarefied air of the city's elite. "The situation is more complex than you imagine, Arthur," I said simply, and I led him into my study. I had prepared the room as I would for an engineering review. On the large polished desk, I had laid out the evidence in a precise, logical order. Exhibit A, the glossy business card for Abe's timepieces. Exhibit B, a simple notarized statement from Abe Cohen attesting to the discovery of the micro-engraving, accompanied by a series of stunningly clear magnified photographs of the patent number on the balance wheel. And Exhibit C, the original 30-year-old licensing agreement from the archive box. Arthur looked at the strange collection of items, his expression a mask of polite professional curiosity. "Elias," he began gently, "if this is about the watch, I'm afraid there's very little we can do. Serena was the legal heir." "This is not about the watch, Arthur," I interrupted, my voice quiet but firm. "The watch is just the key. This," I said, tapping the old stapled contract, "is about the door." For the next 30 minutes, I laid out the story for him. Not the emotional story of a grieving father, but the cold, clear, logistical story of a corporate contract. I told him about the sale of the watch. I showed him the photographs of the patent number, and then I walked him line by line through the elegant, legalistic, and absolutely lethal heritage clause that my wife had written 30 years ago. I watched his face as he read it. He was a man who appreciated the beauty of a well-crafted legal argument the way I appreciated the beauty of a well-crafted machine. As he read, his professional sympathy began to fade, replaced by a slow dawning and absolutely predatory smile. It was the smile of a great white shark that has just scented a single drop of blood in a vast ocean. When he finished reading, he looked up at me, his eyes shining with a profound, almost joyful respect. "My God, Elias," he whispered, his voice full of a lawyer's awe for a perfect, unbreachable contract. "Lena was a poet, Arthur Vance. My lawyer was not a man given to emotional displays. He was a creature of pure, cold logic, a legal machine of the highest order." He read my wife's heritage clause once, then a second time, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. He looked up at me, his eyes shining with a profound, almost joyful respect for a piece of legal craftsmanship. "My God, Elias," he whispered, his voice full of a lawyer's awe for a perfect, unbreachable contract. "Lena was a poet." He stood up and began to pace the study, not in agitation, but with the focused energy of a general planning a campaign. "This is not just a contract, Elias," he said, picking up the old document as if it were a holy text. "This is a work of art. It's a self-triggering, self-contained, and absolutely beautiful legal trap." He placed the contract back on the desk and began to break it down for me, his voice a low, excited murmur. "First," he said, ticking off the points on his fingers, "the consideration for the license, $1 per year, is nominal. That's crucial. It means the court will see that the real consideration, the real price for the license, was not monetary. It was the adherence to the heritage clause." "Second," he continued, "she explicitly defines the Rolex by its serial number as a symbolic artifact. She doesn't call it a piece of jewelry. She calls it a symbol of the foundational integrity of the company. She has legally elevated a sentimental object into a material component of the entire corporate structure. It's brilliant. Absolutely brilliant." He was in his element now, a master admiring the work of another master. "Which brings us to the third and most important point, the breach." He looked me directly in the eye, the predatory smile returning. Your daughter Serena, by selling that watch, did not just commit a sentimental transgression. She committed a material breach of the single most important contract in her company's history. The utmost respect clause is not a suggestion, Elias. It's a non-negotiable condition of the license, and she has violated it publicly and provably. He walked to the window, looking out at the quiet suburban street. And a material breach, he said, turning back to me, his voice dropping to a low, devastating whisper, has consequences. He let the word hang in the air. When one party violates a material condition of a contract, the other party is not only entitled to damages, but is also released from their own obligations under that contract. I was an engineer, not a lawyer, but I understood the catastrophic logic of what he was saying. What does that mean, Arthur? I asked, my voice a quiet rasp. Arthur Vance's smile was a thing of terrible, beautiful simplicity. It means, he said, that as of the moment that pawn shop owner handed your daughter a check for that watch, the licensing agreement for patent number 5123456 became null and void. The contract is broken. And the intellectual property rights, he paused, letting the full crushing weight of his final words land, have reverted back to you. Arthur Vance's words, the intellectual property rights have reverted back to you, were not spoken with a lawyer's cautious ambiguity. They were spoken with the final definitive authority of a master craftsman who has just examined a machine and declared it fundamentally, irrevocably broken. The words hung in the quiet air of my study, and in them I heard the full catastrophic music of my wife's final brilliant move. I had understood the clause, but I had not until that moment understood the full terrifying power of its consequences. Let me be very clear about what this means, Elias, Arthur said, his voice now a low predatory purr. He was a lawyer who was about to explain the legal equivalent of a nuclear bomb. When your daughter sold that watch, she did not just break a promise. She detonated a bomb at the very foundation of her own empire. That $1 a year licensing agreement was the legal bedrock upon which the entire $50 billion valuation of Viridian Dynamics rests, and that bedrock is now gone. It has crumbled to dust. He began to pace again, his energy now too great to be contained in a chair. As of that moment of transaction in the pawn shop, the license became null and void, which means that for the past 3 days, Viridian Dynamics, the company your daughter believes she owns, has been operating illegally. The word illegally was a physical shock. Every product they have manufactured, Arthur continued, his voice a relentless rhythmic series of hammer blows, every shipment that has left their warehouses, every single dollar of revenue they have earned that is in any way connected to your patent, has been an act of intellectual property theft. They are no longer the licensees of your invention, Elias. They are common infringers. He stopped pacing and looked at me, a look of pure, unadulterated professional joy in his eyes. And an infringer, he said, savoring the word, owes the patent holder not a $1 a year fee. An infringer owes the patent holder royalties, retroactive royalties, for every single dollar of profit they have made since the moment the contract was breached. He let the full crushing weight of that statement settle. My mind, the mind of the CEO, began to do the math. The profits from that one patent were in the hundreds of millions of dollars per year. But it gets worse, Arthur said, his smile now a thing of terrible, beautiful simplicity. Because the breach was willful and in bad faith, they sold a symbolic artifact for a vacation. We are not just entitled to standard royalties. We are entitled to sue for treble damages, 3 times the profit, plus legal fees. Plus we can file an immediate injunction to halt all production and sales of any product that uses your patent, which is, I believe, roughly 95% of their entire product line. He walked back to the desk and placed his hands flat on its polished surface. So, to summarize, he said, his voice a quiet final verdict. Your daughter Serena and her husband Chad did not just sell a $5,000 watch. They transformed their $100 million inheritance into a multi-hundred million dollar debt, a debt they now owe directly and personally to you. They are not the owners of a company anymore, Elias. They are tenants in a building they do not own, and the rent is past due. Arthur Vance stood before me, a general who had just explained the beautiful, brutal simplicity of his battle plan. The reversion of the patent rights was not a minor legal victory. It was a complete and total transfer of power. I was no longer the victim. I was the victor. And my daughter, the new wealthy and powerful owner of Viridian Dynamics, was now in the cold, hard eyes of the law nothing more than a common thief. So let me put this in terms that even a layman can understand, Elias. Arthur said, his voice a low, excited purr. As of this moment, your daughter's $100 million empire is operating on a foundational patent that she does not have the legal right to use. He let that statement hang in the air, a masterpiece of legal understatement. She thinks she owns a company. He continued, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. What she actually owns is a $100 million liability. She is, as we speak, engaged in the massive, willful, and incredibly profitable infringement of your intellectual property. She is infringing on her own father's patent. The irony was so profound, so perfectly symmetrical, that it was almost a form of poetry. My daughter, in her rush to cash in on her inheritance, had turned that very inheritance into a weapon that was now aimed directly at her own head. This, Arthur said, tapping the old yellowed contract with a single elegant finger, is our ace in the hole. It is more than an ace. It is the whole damn deck. He began to lay out the consequences, the sheer, beautiful, and devastating power that Lena's final gift had given me. First, we can sue for retroactive royalties. Not the $1 a year in this contract, but the industry standard, which for a patent of this importance is somewhere between 8 and 10% of gross profits for the last 30 years, with interest. The number was so large, so astronomical, it was almost meaningless. It was not a debt. It was an anchor that would pull her entire financial world to the bottom of the ocean. Second, he went on, his eyes gleaming, because the breach was so egregious, she sold a legally defined symbolic artifact to fund a vacation. We can sue for treble damages, 3 times the royalties owed. It's a punitive measure designed to punish exactly this kind of arrogant, bad faith behavior. He was no longer a lawyer. He was an artist describing the colors he was about to use to paint a masterpiece of legal destruction. And third, and this is the most beautiful part, Elias, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper, we can file for an immediate injunction. We can walk into a federal court tomorrow morning and ask a judge to issue an order to cease and desist. An order that would legally compel Viridian Dynamics to immediately halt the production and sale of every single product that utilizes your patent, which is, I believe, their entire catalog. He let the full catastrophic weight of that final statement settle in the quiet room. He was not just talking about suing her. He was talking about turning off the lights. He was talking about shutting down the entire company, the life's work of her mother and me, with a single, simple court order. She had thrown me out of my house, and my wife had just handed me the legal authority to throw her out of her entire life. The power was absolute. It was total. It was a weapon of mass financial destruction, and it was all mine. Arthur Vance, my lawyer, did not celebrate his discovery. A man like Arthur does not celebrate a victory until the opponent has not only been defeated, but has signed a formal, unconditional surrender. The revelation in my study was not an endpoint. It was a starting point. The engine of war had been found. Now it was time to build the weapon. He did not hesitate. He opened his sleek, expensive laptop on my desk, the modern glow of its screen, a stark contrast to the old yellowed contract that lay beside it. His fingers, long and elegant, began to move across the keyboard. He was a craftsman, and his medium was the law. And for the next hour, I watched him build the most elegant, precise, and utterly devastating machine I had ever seen. He was drafting a letter. But to call it a letter is like calling a guillotine a simple machine. It was a legal instrument of execution composed of 2 perfectly balanced and equally lethal parts. The first part, he said without looking up from his screen, is the cease and desist. This is the immediate, non-negotiable demand. It is the part that stops the bleeding. I watched as the words appeared on the screen, a relentless barrage of cold, hard legal prose. The letter formally notified Serena, as the acting head of Viridian Dynamics, that the company was in material breach of its foundational licensing agreement. It cited the heritage clause. It cited the sale of the Rolex. It included as attachments the notarized affidavit from Abe Cohen and the high-resolution photographs of the patent number. It built a case that was not just strong, it was a fortress. And then it delivered its ultimatum. Viridian Dynamics was to immediately cease and desist all manufacturing, marketing, and sales of any and all products that utilized the technology covered by patent number 5123456. This, Arthur murmured, a hint of satisfaction in his voice, is the part that will get their immediate attention. It effectively turns off their entire revenue stream. Today. It was a corporate heart attack delivered by email. But it was the second part of the letter that was the true killing blow. And this, Arthur said, beginning a new section, is the bill. I watched as he drafted the demand for retroactive royalties. He was no longer just a lawyer, he was an accountant, a historian, a predator calculating the full price of his prey's mistake. He explained the legal basis, citing the willful and bad faith nature of the breach. He calculated the industry standard royalty rate of 10% of gross profits, and then he did the math, 30 years of the company's most profitable product line. Based on the publicly available financial records of Viridian Dynamics, he typed, the retroactive royalties owed plus interest currently amount to... He paused, and I saw him do a final calculation in his head. Then he typed the number. A number so large, so catastrophic that it seemed to bend the very light in the room. A number that would not just bankrupt Serena, but would indebt her for the rest of her natural life. It was a figure in the high tens of millions. When he was finished, he printed out the letter on heavy, formal letterhead. He signed it with a flourish of his fountain pen. It was a beautiful and terrible thing to behold. A simple 2-page document that had the power to turn a $100 million inheritance into a $100 million debt. He placed it in an envelope. "This is not a negotiation, Elias," he said, looking at me, his eyes cold and clear. "This is a declaration of terms. We are not asking. We are telling. The moment they receive this, they will have two choices: immediate and total surrender, or a war they cannot possibly win." There was no joy in it for me. I looked at the crisp white envelope. This was not an act of passion. It was an act of physics. An action and a reaction. My daughter had pushed a single small sentimental gear, and she had no idea that it was connected to a machine that was powerful enough to grind her entire world to dust. The lawyer's letter, a 2-page declaration of war, was a masterpiece of legal destruction. But a declaration is only as good as the army that backs it up. And my army at this point consisted of a 30-year-old contract and a memory. It was not enough. I needed physical proof. I needed a witness. I needed to go back to the beginning. The next morning I drove back to the quiet ticking heart of my new strategy, Abe's timepieces. When I walked in, the gentle melodic bell chiming my arrival, Abe looked up from his workbench. He had a look of profound, sympathetic sadness on his face. He had, I am sure, been expecting me. He probably thought I was there to beg, to plead, to empty my bank account, to buy back the one thing I had left of my wife. "Mr. Vance," he said, his voice soft. "I am sorry. The new owner, he is very insistent. I cannot sell it back to you." "I am not here to buy the watch, Mr. Abe," I said, and the words seemed to surprise him. I walked to his counter and placed a simple sealed envelope upon it. "I am here to hire you." He looked at the envelope, then at me, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Hire me for what? A repair?" "No," I said. "I am here to hire you as an expert witness. I am here to hire you for your eyes, for your reputation, and for your professional integrity." I explained what I needed. It was not a normal request. I did not want the watch. I wanted its secret. I wanted high-resolution macro photographs of the micro-engraving on the balance wheel. I wanted them taken by him, a respected professional with a clear chain of custody. And then I wanted him to write a formal notarized affidavit, a sworn legal statement detailing what he had found when he had found it, and his professional opinion on its origin. As I spoke, I saw his expression change. The sympathetic pity was replaced by a slow dawning and absolutely profound respect. He was not a lawyer, but he was a man who had spent a lifetime in a business that often intersected with the sad, desperate, and legally complicated lives of his clients. He understood immediately and intuitively what I was doing. This was not an emotional plea. This was a flanking maneuver. This was a quiet, elegant, and deeply strategic move in a war he had not even known was being fought. He looked at me no longer as a grieving old man, but as a fellow craftsman, a fellow strategist. A slow, knowing smile spread across his face. "You, sir," he said, his voice a low murmur of pure admiration, "are a very, very clever man." He did not even look at the envelope. He simply nodded. "It will be my honor," he said. For the next 2 hours, his shop was no longer a place of repair, but a forensic laboratory. He worked with the meticulous, unhurried precision of a master. He set up a small professional photography rig with specialized lighting and a macro lens that looked more like a microscope. He documented every step. A photo of the watch with the case back on, a photo of the case back removed, and then a series of stunningly clear, impossibly detailed photographs of the balance wheel, the tiny secret message, USPAT 5123456, rendered as clear and undeniable as a headline on the front page of a newspaper. While the photos printed, he sat down at his old elegant desk, and on his formal letterhead, he wrote out his statement in a clear, strong, and beautifully legible hand. He described his credentials, his 40 years of experience. He described the watch, its serial number. And he described his discovery of the engraving, attesting under penalty of perjury that it was a unique post-manufacturing modification of the highest possible skill. We walked together to a notary 2 doors down, and he signed the document in her presence, the heavy official stamp of the state making a satisfying final thud on the paper. I paid him for his time, the amount in the envelope more than generous. He tried to refuse the extra, but I insisted. "This is not a fee for a service, Abe," I said. "This is a retainer, for the man who is about to become the star witness in the trial of my daughter's life." I walked out of his shop, not with the watch, but with something infinitely more valuable. I had the truth certified, notarized, and ready for war. I returned to my house, but it was not the same house I had left. The quiet was no longer the heavy, grief-stricken silence of a tomb. It was the quiet of a command center, the quiet of a perfectly calibrated waiting game. I walked into my workshop, my sanctuary, and the steady, rhythmic ticking of 100 clocks was no longer a sad reminder of time passing without my wife. It was a countdown. Each tick was a second closer to the moment my daughter's curated stolen world would detonate. I did not call my lawyer for an update. I did not pace the floors in anticipation. I did what I have always done when faced with a complex problem. I went to work. I sat at my workbench and began the slow, meticulous process of disassembling, cleaning, and reassembling an old, beautiful Patek Philippe movement that I had been meaning to restore for years. My hands, which had been trembling with rage and grief just days before, were now perfectly steady. I unscrewed the tiny microscopic screws, lifted the delicate bridges, and removed the gears one by one, placing them in their correct order on the green felt. It was a meditation, a process of imposing order on a chaotic world. While my hands worked on the tiny physical machine, my mind worked on the larger, more abstract one. I pictured them in Bali. I had seen the brochures Chad had left behind, the ones for the impossibly luxurious 5-star private villa. I could see them clearly. I saw Chad lounging by an infinity pool that seemed to spill into the Indian Ocean, a tropical drink in his hand, his phone held up to capture the perfect, self-satisfied selfie. I saw Serena, my daughter, lying on a white sand beach, her eyes closed, the sun warming her face, the sound of the gentle waves a soothing lullaby. They would be feeling triumphant. They had done it. They had liquidated the past, cashed in on a sentimental old fool, and were now living the life they believed they deserved. They would be posting the pictures on social media, of course. Carefully curated images of their perfect lives designed to inspire the envy of their friends. #Bali life. #blessed. #living our best life. They were so busy performing their happiness that they would have no idea that their happiness was a short-term lease on a property that was already in foreclosure. They were sunbathing on the deck of the Titanic, completely oblivious to the iceberg that was at that very moment tearing a fatal gash in the hull of their financial world. I placed the final jewel back into its setting, the tiny ruby, a perfect blood-red heart in the center of the golden gear. I thought of Lena, my wife. She had been a master of this kind of warfare. The quiet, patient, long game. She had known that the most effective attack is the one your enemy never sees coming. This whole plan, this quiet, elegant, and devastatingly effective trap, it was her design. I was simply the mechanic, the watchmaker, executing her final brilliant schematic. The sun began to set, casting long, golden shadows across my workshop. I had just finished reassembling the movement. I gave the crown a single gentle wind, and the balance wheel, the tiny heart of the machine, sprang to life, its steady, perfect rhythm a testament to the power of a well-designed system. And at that exact moment, my phone rang. It was Arthur Vance. "The package has been delivered," he said, his voice a calm, professional, and utterly final statement. "One email to your daughter's personal account, and one delivered by certified courier to the Viridian Dynamics corporate office. The clock is ticking, Elias." I thanked him and hung up. I sat in the growing darkness, the only light the bright lamp on my workbench. I listened to the quiet, perfect ticking of the watch I had just restored, and I waited for the inevitable, panicked, and glorious sound of my own phone ringing. The waiting was the easiest part. For 2 days I did not think about Bali. I did not think about my daughter or my son-in-law, or the letter that was about to detonate their lives. I went into my workshop, my quiet, orderly sanctuary, and I returned to the work. I sat at my bench, the world shrinking to the tiny, intricate universe inside an old timepiece, and I found a measure of peace. While my hands were busy with the familiar, honest work of a craftsman, I knew that my lawyer, Arthur Vance, was busy with his. Arthur was not a man who delayed. He was a creature of precision and immediate, overwhelming force. I could picture him in his quiet, elegant office, the demand letter now signed by me sitting on his desk. It was no longer a draft. It was a live weapon. At precisely 9 o'clock in the morning, 2 days after my visit to his office, he would have begun the attack. It would be a two-pronged assault, one digital, one physical, both perfectly timed. First, the email. He would have opened a new message, his fingers moving with a practiced, efficient speed across the keyboard. The recipient, serena.sterling@viridiandynamics.com. He would have also copied her personal email address, the one Arthur's paralegal had found in a matter of minutes. The subject line would be simple, professional, and utterly terrifying: urgent legal matter. Breach of licensing agreement. Patent 5123456. He would attach the documents, a series of digital torpedoes aimed at the heart of her empire. Attachment 1, the demand letter itself, a formal declaration of war. Attachment 2, the high-resolution macro photographs of the patent number on the balance wheel, clear, undeniable proof. Attachment 3, the notarized affidavit from Mr. Abe Cohen, the expert witness testimony. And Attachment 4, a certified copy of the original 1988 licensing agreement with the Heritage Clause highlighted in a stark, brutal yellow. He would read the email one last time, checking for typos, ensuring its cold, legal perfection. And then he would click send. A single, quiet, almost anticlimactic click. And with that, the first missile was launched. It would travel silently, instantly across the globe, landing in a server in Bali, waiting patiently in Serena's inbox, a digital time bomb set to explode the moment she opened her laptop. But Arthur would not rely on a single strike. At the exact same moment, he would be on the phone with a bonded professional courier service. The instructions would be simple. "I have a package," he'd say. "It needs to be delivered to the corporate headquarters of Viridian Dynamics. Hand delivery only. To the office of the acting CEO, Ms. Serena Sterling. If she is not present, it is to be signed for by her executive assistant and left on her desk." A second identical set of the documents printed on heavy, watermarked legal paper would be placed in a crisp, intimidating envelope. A young man on a motorcycle would be dispatched, weaving through the Atlanta traffic, a messenger of doom. While Serena and Chad were likely lounging by their private pool posting filtered photos of their perfect vacation, 2 identical packages of their own destruction were arriving, one silently in the digital world, one with the undeniable physical finality of a signature on a clipboard in the real one. The stage was set. The letters had been sent. The quiet, ticking silence was about to be shattered by the sound of a world breaking. I returned to my workshop, the demand letter now a ghost, a digital signal traveling silently and invisibly across the world. My work was done. The legal machine had been activated. All that was left was the waiting. I did not pace. I did not watch the phone. I sat at my workbench, the place where I have always made sense of the world, and I returned to the work of my hands. I picked up the old Patek Philippe movement. I had been restoring a beautiful, complex little engine of time. I settled the loop into my eye, and the world shrank to the tiny, glittering universe of gears and springs. My hands, which had trembled with grief just days ago, were now perfectly steady. There is a deep and profound honesty in a well-made machine. It does not lie. It does not make excuses. Each gear has a purpose. Each spring has a tension. If one part fails, the entire system fails. It is a world of pure, unyielding cause and effect. As I worked, my mind was in 2 places at once. Here in the quiet, ticking sanctuary of my workshop, and thousands of miles away in a sun-drenched villa in Bali. I pictured them. Chad lounging by an infinity pool, a cocktail in his hand, laughing his loud, empty laugh. Serena, my daughter, lying on a daybed, scrolling through her phone, her mind filled with the shallow, fleeting anxieties of a woman whose only job is to be beautiful and admired. They were living in a fantasy, A world without consequences, a world funded by the sale of a promise they did not understand. They were so busy curating the images of their perfect life for social media Bali life, #blessed, that they were completely oblivious to the reality that was at that very moment hurtling towards them at the speed of light. Each tick of the clock on my wall was a second closer. A tick for the email leaving my lawyer's server. A tick for it crossing an ocean through a fiber optic cable. A tick for it arriving silently and invisibly in Serena's inbox, a digital time bomb nestled between a spa confirmation and an email from a luxury brand. They were sunbathing on the deck of the Titanic, complaining that the ice in their drinks was melting too fast, with no idea that the real iceberg was already tearing a fatal gash in the hull of their financial world. This was Lena's final masterpiece, a trap built not of steel and springs, but of law and consequences. She had known that the only way to teach a lesson to people who value nothing is to take away everything. I was simply the mechanic she had left behind, the one who knew how to turn the key and start the engine. The sun began to set, casting long golden shadows across my workshop. I placed the final jewel back into its setting, the tiny ruby, a perfect blood-red heart in the center of a golden gear. I gave the crown a single gentle wind, and the balance wheel, the tiny heart of the machine, sprang to life, its steady, perfect rhythm, a testament to the power of a well-designed system. And at that exact moment, my phone buzzed on the workbench beside me. It was Arthur Vance. "The package has been delivered," he said, his voice a calm, professional, and utterly final statement. "The email was sent, and the courier has confirmed that a hard copy was signed for at the Viridian corporate office 10 minutes ago. The clock is officially ticking, Elias." I thanked him and hung up. I sat in the growing darkness, the only light the bright lamp on my workbench. I listened to the quiet, perfect ticking of the watch I had just restored, and I waited for the inevitable panicked and glorious sound of my own phone ringing. While my lawyer's digital and physical torpedoes were silently streaking toward their targets, another scene was playing out half a world away. A paradise. I did not need to see it to know what it looked like. Chad, in his infinite arrogance, had left the glossy travel brochure on the coffee table in my study, a final parting insult. So I could picture it perfectly. I sat in my quiet, ticking workshop, and I built their world in my mind. The villa was a masterpiece of modern tropical architecture, a palace of glass and white stone perched on a cliff overlooking the turquoise expanse of the Indian Ocean. The air would be thick with the sweet, heavy scent of frangipani and the salty tang of the sea. I saw them, my daughter and her husband, not as they were, but as they desperately wanted to be seen. They would be lounging by the edge of an infinity pool, the water a perfect shimmering sheet that seemed to merge with the sky. Chad would be reclining on a white linen daybed, his chest puffed out, his sunglasses hiding his empty eyes. He would be holding a colorful drink with a small umbrella in it, a man performing the role of a king. In a kingdom he had not built, a kingdom he had stolen. Serena would not be relaxing, she would be working. Her work, the only work she had ever truly mastered, was the curation of appearances. She would be orchestrating a photo shoot, her phone in her hand, directing her husband. "A little to the left, Chad. Look out at the ocean like you're thinking about your next big deal." She would take 100 photos, searching for the one perfect image, the one that projected the effortless wealth and success they so desperately craved. Then she would spend 20 minutes crafting the perfect, casually boastful caption. "Another tough day at the office. Bally life. CEO, blessed." I could hear their conversation, the lazy, self-satisfied murmur of two people who believed they had gotten away with it. "This is the life, baby," Chad would say, taking a sip of his drink. "This is what it's all about, smart decisions, liquidating underperforming assets." He would say it with a wink, a smug, self-congratulatory reference to the watch. My wife's watch. The promise. To him it was just an underperforming asset, a dusty relic that he and his financial genius had cleverly converted into this tropical paradise. He was a corporate raider who had just successfully stripped the assets of a dying company, my heart. Serena would laugh, a light tinkling sound that no longer reached her eyes. She would be too busy uploading the photo, watching the likes and the envious comments begin to roll in. "OMG, I'm so jealous. You guys are living the dream." Each comment would be a small hit of validation, a confirmation that her performance was a success, that her betrayal had been worth it. They would order lunch brought to them by a smiling, silent servant. They would eat exotic fruits and freshly grilled fish, their conversation a meaningless tapestry of gossip and future plans. They'd talk about the cars they would buy, the other trips they would take. They would plan the spending of a fortune that was at that very moment legally ceasing to be theirs. In their minds, they were completely safe. They were thousands of miles away in a bubble of luxury protected by a wall of money they thought was impenetrable. They had no idea that the foundation of that wall was a single 30-year-old contract, a contract they had just violated in the most spectacular way possible. As they posted another picture of a perfect sunset, a courier was walking through the silent air-conditioned halls of Viridian Dynamics in Atlanta. As they ordered another round of cocktails, an email was sitting unread in Serena's inbox, its subject line, a quiet, ticking time bomb. They were celebrating a victory in a war they had already irrevocably lost. And I, in my quiet workshop, surrounded by the honest, ticking hearts of 100 beautiful machines, simply waited for the sound of their world breaking. The email would have arrived in her inbox at around 10 o'clock at night Bali time. I can picture the scene with perfect, painful clarity. Serena would be lying on a large white linen bed in their villa, the sheer curtains billowing in the warm tropical breeze. The sound of the ocean would be a gentle, soothing whisper outside her window. She would have just finished a long, leisurely dinner full of expensive wine and easy laughter. She would be feeling content, victorious, and completely, utterly safe. She would have been scrolling through her social media, admiring the likes on her sunset photos, basking in the reflected glory of her perfect, stolen life. Then, with a sigh of bored obligation, she would have decided to check her work email, a perfunctory 5-minute task, before she went to sleep. She would open her laptop, the bright glow of the screen illuminating her face in the darkened room. Her inbox would be full of the usual mundane corporate correspondence, meeting requests, weekly reports, and then she would see it. An email with a subject line that was so jarring, so out of place in her tropical paradise, that it would have made her pause. Urgent legal matter, breach of licensing agreement, patent 5123456. The sender, Arthur Vance. She would have recognized the name, my lawyer, the man who had handled my corporate affairs for 20 years. A small cold flicker of annoyance would have disturbed the perfect tranquility of her evening. Her father, still whining about that stupid watch. How pathetic, how predictable. A small cruel smile would touch her lips. She would have turned to Chad, who would be lying beside her half asleep. "You're not going to believe this," she'd say with a dismissive laugh. "My father actually hired a lawyer. He's sending threatening emails about the watch." Chad would have grunted, uninterested. "Tell him to get a life," he'd mumble. "The old man has too much time on his hands." Serena would have agreed. It was all so sad, so desperate. A feeble last-ditch attempt by a powerless old man to reclaim a piece of sentimental junk. She would have felt a surge of superiority, a feeling of pity for this pathetic creature who couldn't just let things go. She would click on the email not with a sense of dread, but with a feeling of amused curiosity. She was a lawyer herself. She knew how these things worked. She was expecting a blustering, emotional letter full of empty legal threats that she could easily dismiss. She was looking forward to forwarding it to Grant in the morning so they could have a good laugh about it over breakfast. She would see the list of attachments, the PDF files with their formal, official-looking names. Notarized affidavit of A. Cohen. Macro photographs, she would scoff. How dramatic. How theatrical. He had really gone to a lot of trouble for this little performance. The mouse was roaring. It was almost cute. With a final dismissive click, her finger still sticky with the sweet residue of a tropical dessert, my daughter would have opened the first attachment, the demand letter, and her perfect, peaceful, and utterly fraudulent world would have begun to come to an end. She would have opened the first attachment with a sense of bored, detached amusement. The demand letter. Cease and desist. The words were so dramatic, so serious. It was like watching a child play dress-up in his father's oversized suit. She would have started to skim it, her lawyer's eyes flying over the dense, legalistic prose, looking for the meat of the argument, the part she could easily dismantle and laugh about later. She would have seen the reference to the original licensing agreement from 1988. Quaint. She would have seen the mention of the heritage clause. Poetic but legally meaningless, she'd assume. A sentimental piece of fluff. And then she would have seen the next part, the part that detailed the breach. The part that explicitly named the Rolex watch by its serial number. The part that defined its sale, not as a private family transaction, but as a material breach of a foundational corporate contract. Her amusement would have begun to fade, replaced by a small, cold flicker of professional unease. This was more detailed, more specific than she had expected. This was not the work of a sad old man. This was the work of a very expensive, very thorough lawyer. She would have scrolled down, her heart beginning to beat a little faster now. She would have seen the attachments referenced, the notarized affidavit from a man named Abe Cohen, the high-resolution photographs. Her hand holding the mouse would have frozen. Photographs of what? A sudden cold dread would begin to snake its way up her spine. She would click on the next attachment, and the image would fill her screen. A stunning, impossibly clear, magnified photograph of the inside of her mother's watch, a universe of tiny, perfect gears, and there on the surface of the balance wheel, so small it was a miracle, yet so clear it was undeniable, was the number. USPAT 5123456. The blood would have turned to ice in her veins. It was not a random number. It was the number. The foundational patent. The source code of her entire inheritance. The secret number that was the legal and moral cornerstone of Viridian Dynamics, and it had been hidden for 30 years inside the very object she had just sold for a handful of cash. The breath would catch in her throat. The beautiful, warm, tropical air of her villa would suddenly feel cold, thin, and hard to breathe. The gentle whisper of the ocean outside would sound like the hiss of a snake. This was not a prank. This was not a sentimental plea. This was a checkmate planned 30 years ago by a woman whose strategic genius she had inherited but had never truly understood. Her hands trembling, she would go back to the first document, the demand letter. She would not skim it this time. She would read every single brutal word. She would read the part that explained how the breach of the heritage clause rendered the $1 licensing agreement null and void. She would read the part that explained how the intellectual property rights had automatically and irrevocably reverted back to the original patent holder, to her father. And then she would get to the final paragraph, the bill, the part that explained that Viridian Dynamics was now operating illegally and that it owed retroactive royalties for every dollar of profit it had ever made from that patent. She would see the number that Arthur Vance had so carefully, so professionally, and so devastatingly calculated. A number in the high tens of millions. A number so large, so catastrophic, so completely and utterly world-ending that it did not seem real. She would stare at the screen, at the string of zeros that seemed to mock her, to laugh at her. The $42 million fortune she had inherited 2 weeks ago had just been transformed by the simple, undeniable logic of a contract she had never bothered to read into a debt so massive it would not only bankrupt her, but the company, her mother's legacy, and her entire future. The laptop would feel like it was burning her skin. She would push it away, a small strangled gasp escaping her lips. The paradise was gone. The villa was gone. All that was left was the cold, hard, and utterly inescapable truth. She was not an heiress, she was a debtor, and the creditor was the useless old man she had just thrown out of his own home. While my daughter was drowning in the cold, hard reality of the law, her husband Chad would have been a different story. He was not a creature of the law. He was a creature of bluffs, of intimidation, of pure, uncut arrogance. I can see him watching Serena's face crumble, the color draining from her cheeks as she stared at the laptop screen. And he would have felt not fear but contempt. He would see her reaction not as a logical response to a mortal threat, but as a form of feminine weakness, an emotional overreaction. "What is it now, Serena?" he would have said with a heavy performative sigh. "Did your father send you a sad poem?" He would have walked over to the bed, a king addressing a hysterical courtier, and he would have taken the laptop from her. "Let me see this pathetic little love letter." He would have chuckled, ready to mock the feeble attempts of the useless old man. He would have started to skim the letter, a smug, dismissive smirk on his face. He would see the legal jargon, the cease and desist, and he would have scoffed. Empty threats. He would see the demand for tens of millions of dollars, and he would have laughed out loud. "Is he insane?" he'd say. "He's demanding a fortune he could never win in 1,000 years. This is a joke." He would have been ready to close the laptop, to dismiss the entire thing as the desperate, delusional ramblings of a man he had already beaten. But Chad was a predator, and a predator, no matter how arrogant, always notices the details of the kill. His eyes would have snagged on the attachments, the name Abe Cohen, the phrase notarized affidavit, and then he would have opened the photographs. He wouldn't be looking at the watch, he would be looking for the trick, and he would see it. The tiny, perfect laser-etched number on the balance wheel. US Pat 5123456. The smirk would have frozen on his face. The laughter would have died in his throat. He was not a lawyer. He did not know the intricacies of contract law. But he was an investor, and he understood one thing better than anyone: the value of a core asset. He knew that number. Not by heart, but he knew what it represented. It was the foundational patent, the source code. The one single irreplaceable piece of intellectual property upon which the entire multi-billion-dollar valuation of Viridian Dynamics was built. And it was inside the watch. It was in that single devastating moment of pure horrifying clarity that he would have finally truly understood. The letter was not a bluff. The financial demand was not a joke. It was a bill. It was an invoice for a product he had been using illegally. His entire world, his entire self-image as the brilliant conquering investor, was built on the assumption that he owned the company. He had just discovered that he did not. He was not the owner. He was a tenant. He had built his entire empire, his entire identity, on a piece of land he had never owned. And he had just received a final non-negotiable eviction notice from the landlord he had spat on. The blood would have drained from his face. He would have sunk down onto the edge of the bed, the laptop on his knees, his hands trembling. The $42 million inheritance wasn't an asset anymore. It was the bill. He was not a king. He was a fraud who had convinced investors to back him, who had taken out loans, who had built a life all on the basis of an asset he had just discovered was stolen. He would look at his wife, at her pale, terrified face, and he would see not his partner, but his accomplice. The paradise of Bali had just become a courtroom, and he was the star witness for his own prosecution. The star witness and the defendant and the man who had just been found guilty on all charges. The call from Bali did not come immediately. It took 2 full days. 2 days of quiet, ticking silence in my workshop. 2 days for the digital torpedo to cross the ocean, for the physical letter to land on Serena's empty desk in Atlanta, and for the news to finally, inevitably reach their sun-drenched paradise. I can imagine the sequence of events. The initial confusion. The frantic calls from her assistant. The dawning horror. I was sitting at my workbench, a half-restored vintage Omega movement spread out on the green felt before me, when my phone finally rang. The screen displayed a long, unfamiliar string of international digits. The call I had been waiting for. I let it ring, twice a small, quiet act of asserting control. Then I answered, "Vance." I said, my voice calm, neutral. The sound that came through the phone was not a greeting, it was a shriek, a high-pitched, ragged, and utterly furious sound. "Dad!" It was not the voice of my daughter, the poised, elegant lawyer. It was the shriek of a cornered animal, a creature of pure, panicked rage. "What is this? What did you do?" I did not speak. I simply held the phone a few inches from my ear, listening to the sound of her world breaking. "The letter," she screamed, her voice cracking with the strain. "The lawyers, the ridiculous, insane demand for $87 million. What is this joke? You can't do this to me." "I did nothing, Serena," I replied, and my voice was so quiet, so reasonable, it seemed to infuriate her even more. "I am simply responding to a business transaction that you initiated." "A business transaction?" She repeated, her voice a strangled, incredulous whisper. "I sold a watch. An old dusty watch that was just sitting in your drawer." "No, Serena," I said, and my voice was the patient, steady tone of an engineer explaining a fatal design flaw. "You did not sell a watch. You sold a material component of a legally binding contract, a contract you, as the new owner of Viridian Dynamics, are obligated to uphold." The line went quiet for a second. The rage was being replaced by a dawning, terrifying confusion. The lawyer in her was beginning to process the words, to see the cold, hard edges of the trap. "The heritage clause," I said, giving the knife a gentle twist. "Section 4B of the original IP licensing agreement. I believe my lawyer sent you a copy. Your mother wrote it herself 30 years ago. It's a beautiful piece of legal work. You should read it sometime." "You're trying to ruin me," she whispered, the fight draining out of her, replaced by a raw, naked fear. "You're trying to take everything." "Again, you are mistaken," I said. "I am not taking anything. The contract is very clear. You broke the terms of the agreement. The license is now null and void. The patent has reverted to me. The money your company has been making from my invention for the last 5 days has been an act of theft. And the letter you received is simply the invoice for that theft. It is not an act of aggression, Serena. It is an act of simple, straightforward accounting." She was silent. I had taken the emotional family drama she had expected, and I had turned it into a cold, boring, and absolutely terrifying business problem. A problem she could not solve. "It was just a watch," she finally whispered, the last pathetic defense of a woman who has nothing left. "No," I said softly, looking at the beautiful, intricate machine on my workbench. "It was never just a watch. It was the promise. It was the foundation. And you sold it. The conversation is over, Serena. When you are ready to discuss the terms of your company's surrender, have your lawyer call my lawyer. We have nothing more to talk about." I hung up the phone. The quiet ticking silence of my workshop returned, and it was the most powerful sound in the world. The phone call from Bali was a storm of noise and fury. Serena's voice was a high-pitched shriek, a sound I had not heard since she was a small child who had fallen and scraped her knee. But this was not the cry of a child in pain. It was the roar of a queen whose kingdom had just been taken from her. "You can't do this to me!" she screamed, her voice cracking with the strain of the intercontinental connection. "I am the owner of this company." The will was clear. I let her rage wash over me, a tidal wave of impotent fury. I did not interrupt. I did not defend myself. I simply listened, a quiet, immovable rock in the face of her storm. When her frantic, panicked accusations finally ran out of breath, I spoke, and my voice was not the voice of a father. It was the voice of a lawyer, a CEO, a man explaining the cold, hard terms of a contract that had been breached. "I am not doing anything, Serena," I said, my voice as calm and steady as the ticking of a clock. "Your mother did this 30 years ago. You are a lawyer. You of all people should understand the sanctity of a contract." "It's a 30-year-old piece of paper," she shrieked. "It's a sentimental piece of garbage. It can't be legally binding." "On the contrary," I replied, my voice a quiet, relentless lecture. "It is the most legally binding document in your entire company. It is the foundation. And the sentimental piece of garbage you're referring to, the heritage clause, was the one and only condition upon which I granted your mother's company the right to use my patent for $1 a year. It was a test of character, Serena, a test that your mother built into the very DNA of her will. And you have failed it." I could hear her breathing a ragged, panicked sound. The lawyer in her was beginning to understand. The daughter in her was in a state of pure, terrified shock. "She did this to me," she whispered, her voice a broken, incredulous thing. "No," I said, and my voice softened just a fraction with the weight of the truth. "She did this for you. She was trying to protect you. She was trying to teach you a lesson she was afraid you would never learn otherwise. The lesson of value. The difference between the price of a thing and its worth." I let that sink in, the final heartbreaking lesson from her mother. "You looked at your mother's legacy," I continued, my voice now as cold and clear as a surgeon's scalpel. "The beautiful, perfect machine that she and I built together over a lifetime of sacrifice, and you saw nothing but a price tag. You sold your mother's promise for the price of a vacation. So now," I said, delivering the final devastating verdict, "you will have to pay the market rate. The conversation is over, Serena. When you are ready to discuss the terms of your company's surrender, have your lawyer call my lawyer. We have nothing more to talk about." I hung up the phone, and the quiet, ticking silence of my workshop returned. The phone was not hung up. It was snatched. I heard the scuffle on the other end of the line, a sudden violent sound followed by Serena's small cry of protest. And then a new voice. A familiar voice, a voice I had come to associate with the casual, corrosive poison of my life, came on the line. It was not a voice. It was a roar. "You think you're so smart, old man." It was Chad. He was bellowing into the phone, his voice a distorted, crackling thing of pure animalistic rage. He had been listening. He had heard my quiet final words to Serena, and his fragile narcissistic ego could not stand it. He had to intervene. He had to reassert his dominance. "You think you can scare us with some musty old piece of paper?" He screamed, his voice so loud I had to hold the phone a few inches from my ear. "I've dealt with tougher guys than you in my sleep. I will sue you into the ground. I'll hire a team of lawyers that will make your little ambulance chaser look like a first-year law student." I did not speak. I simply listened. I let him empty his arsenal of impotent threats. It was a fascinating and deeply pathetic display. He was a man with a hammer, and he had just run into a problem that could not be solved by hitting it. "I'll sue you for elder abuse," he shrieked, the accusation so absurd it was almost comical. For emotional distress, I will tell the world that you are a vindictive, senile old fool who is trying to steal his own daughter's inheritance. You'll be a laughingstock. I will destroy your name and your reputation and everything you've ever built. He was projecting. He was accusing me of the very things he himself had done. It was the last desperate act of a con man who has been caught trying to muddy the waters to create chaos, to find some way, any way, to escape the simple, elegant, and inescapable truth of his own failure. He finally ran out of breath, his furious tirade ending in a series of ragged, gasping breaths. He was waiting for me to react, to shout back, to engage in the kind of ugly, emotional brawl that he was so good at winning. He was waiting for me to be afraid. I let the silence stretch for a long, long moment, a silence that I knew was more terrifying to him than any shouted threat. And then I spoke. My voice was not loud. It was not angry. It was the quiet, calm, and utterly final voice of a man who holds all the cards. "Are you finished, Chad?" I asked. The simple question seemed to break him. "No, I'm not finished," he roared, but the conviction was gone. It was just noise now, a sound of pure, desperate frustration. "I'm not finished until I see you in a courtroom." "Okay," I said. It was a single, simple word, but it was a word of agreement, of acceptance of an invitation. He had just threatened to sue me, and I had just calmly, quietly, and without a moment's hesitation accepted his terms. He didn't know what to do. He had expected me to fight, to argue, to plead. He had no strategy for this, for my quiet, unshakable confidence. "Go ahead, Chad," I said, and my voice was as gentle and as final as a priest giving a last rite. "File your lawsuit. My lawyers are waiting." And with that, I hung up the phone. I did not give him a chance to reply. I did not give him the satisfaction of a final shouted insult. I simply ended the conversation. The connection was cut. And he was left thousands of miles away in a paradise that had just become a prison, with nothing but the dead silent hum of a disconnected line and the dawning horrifying realization that he had just threatened to sue a man who was in fact begging him to do so. The phone rang again less than 10 minutes later. It was a testament to Chad's predictable, explosive arrogance. He had likely spent those 10 minutes screaming, throwing something expensive, and then upon realizing that his rage was a useless tool against a legal document, he would have collapsed, leaving my daughter to clean up his mess. She was, after all, the lawyer. I answered my voice, the same calm, neutral tone. "Vance." "Dad," she said. It was Serena. Her voice was completely different. The rage was gone, replaced by a thin, brittle, and utterly terrified composure. It was the voice of a lawyer who knows her client is guilty on all charges and is now desperately seeking a plea bargain. "Okay," she said, her voice a rush of panicked professional jargon. "Okay, let's be rational. We've seen the letter. We understand your position. But this is a disproportionate response. A demand of this size, it's not a legal remedy, it's a nuclear option. We can litigate this for years." I let her finish her desperate, legalistic monologue. She was trying to turn this back into a world she understood, a world of motions and counter-motions, of billable hours and long, drawn-out legal battles. "No, we can't, Serena," I said, and my voice was gentle but firm. "You are thinking of this as a lawsuit, a fight that has yet to begin. You need to understand that the fight is already over, and you have already lost. What is happening now is simply the collection of the debt." "But the number... it's insane," she pleaded. "There's no way we can pay that." "That," I said, "is the second thing you don't seem to understand." I paused, letting the silence on the intercontinental line stretch, a silence that I knew was costing her a fortune in hotel phone charges, a tiny, insignificant addition to the mountain of debt she now owed me. "You're thinking of that number as a static thing, a final bill. It is not. It is a running total." I could hear her sharp, panicked intake of breath. "Think of it as a clock, Serena," I said, my voice quiet, almost conversational. "Like your mother's watch. The moment you sold it, a different kind of clock started ticking. A very, very expensive one. Every single day that Viridian Dynamics continues to operate every day, it manufactures and sells a product based on my patent. It is committing a fresh act of infringement. And every day the amount of royalties you owe me grows. As we are speaking right now, you are deeper in debt to me than you were a minute ago. The number in that letter is already out of date. The truth of it, the simple, relentless, and terrifying mathematics of it was a new kind of horror for her. She was not just in a hole. She was in a hole that was getting deeper by the second. And that, I continued, is not even my most powerful move. What are you talking about? She whispered, her voice a raw, broken thing. You are a lawyer, Annalise, I said. You understand what a federal injunction is. I do not have to wait for the royalties to accumulate. I have the legal right as the sole patent holder to walk into a federal court tomorrow morning and ask a judge to order your company to immediately cease and desist all operations related to my intellectual property. I do not have to sue you for the money, Serena. I can simply turn the company off. Today. The silence on the other end of the line was the sound of a world ending. She finally understood the full catastrophic scope of her mother's brilliant, terrible trap. They were not in a legal battle. They were in a hostage crisis, and I was holding the only key to their company's survival. So you see, I said, my voice a quiet final verdict. The company your mother and I built is bleeding out, and my signature is the only thing in the world that can stop it. The only thing you have left to negotiate is how much you are willing to pay for it. The finality of my words, I can simply turn the company off, was the last fatal blow. The complex legal arguments, the financial calculations, all of it was just noise compared to that one simple, terrifying image. The company, her mother's legacy, her entire identity turned off like a light switch. The lawyer in her, the cold professional strategist, simply evaporated. All that was left was the terrified, broken child who had just realized that the game was over and she had lost in the most catastrophic way imaginable. A sound escaped her lips, a small, strangled, animalistic cry of pure, unadulterated terror. The phone slipped from her hand, clattering onto the expensive floor of the Bali villa. I heard Chad's voice in the background, a faint, angry, Serena. What is it? What did he say? But she did not answer him. She sank to her knees, her hands covering her face, and a wave of raw, ragged sobs tore through her body. These were not the controlled, performative tears from the will reading. These were not the angry, frustrated tears of a woman who has lost an argument. These were the ugly, soul-deep sobs of a person who has just stared into the abyss of her own ruin. Please, she wailed, her voice a mangled, unrecognizable thing, and I realized she had put the phone on speaker. The plea was for me. Daddy, please, don't. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. The apology, the one that had been absent for weeks, finally came. But it was not a currency she could use to buy her way out of this. It was the desperate, meaningless cry of a bankrupt soul. We'll give it back, she cried, her words a jumbled, panicked torrent. The money from the watch, I'll give it all back. We'll cancel the trip. We'll go home, right now. She was trying to undo it, to rewind time, to put the pin back in a grenade that had already detonated. She was a child promising to clean her room after she had already burned the house down. Please don't turn it off, she begged, the words choked with sobs. Mom's company, please, it's all I have left of her. The irony was so thick, so bitter, it was almost a physical taste in my mouth. She had sold the one thing I had left of her mother, and now she was begging me not to destroy the company she had left. It's over, Serena, I said, and my voice was not cruel. It was just tired. The voice of a man who has seen too much, lost too much. Your vacation is over. Your dream is over. All of this, I said, gesturing to the quiet, ticking sanctuary of my workshop. All of this was set in motion the moment you decided that a vacation was more valuable than your mother's promise. I did not wait for another plea. I did not wait for another sob. I simply ended the call. The connection was cut, and she was left 10,000 miles away in a paradise that had just become a prison, with nothing but the dead silent hum of a disconnected line and the quiet, terrible, and unstoppable sound of her own world coming to an end. The flight from paradise is the longest journey in the world. I did not have to be on the plane to see it, to feel the crushing weight of the silence inside that aluminum tube hurtling through the darkness at 600 miles an hour. I could construct the scene in my mind with the cold, clear logic of an engineer because I had designed the system that had put them there. The journey would have begun in a frantic, panicked rush. The beautiful villa which had been their palace of triumph would have become a prison they were desperate to escape. They would have thrown their expensive, now unaffordable clothes into their suitcases, the silence between them a thick, poisonous thing more suffocating than the tropical humidity. There would be no wistful last look at the infinity pool, no fond farewell to the paradise they had briefly occupied, only a hurried, shame-faced retreat. At the airport, the first of many new humiliations would have been waiting for them. There would be no VIP lounge, no expedited security line. They would be just two more stressed, angry travelers in a long, slow-moving queue, surrounded by the noise and the chaos of ordinary people, a world they had thought they had escaped forever. Chad, a man whose identity was built on the performance of his own importance, would have been incandescent with rage at every small indignity. The slow-moving line. The TSA agent telling him to take off his $1,000 shoes. The crying baby in the departure lounge. Each would be a personal assault, a fresh reminder of his new powerless status. On the plane, they would not be turning left into the hushed, carpeted world of first class. They would be turning right into the cramped, chaotic world of coach. They would find their seats two small, insufficient spaces, their knees pressed against the seat in front of them, a perfect physical metaphor for their new, constricted lives. And then, for the next 18 hours, there would be only the droning, monotonous funeral dirge of the jet engines and the vast Arctic silence between them. They would not speak. What was there to say? The blame had already been assigned. The partnership had been dissolved. All that was left was the shared, suffocating intimacy of their mutual ruin. Chad would be staring straight ahead, his jaw clenched, his mind a frantic, useless whirlwind of rage. He would be replaying my final words, my lawyer's words, searching for a loophole, a weakness, an angle of attack. But he would find none. He was a bully who had just discovered that his fists were useless against a legal document. His anger would have nowhere to go, so it would curdle, turning inward, becoming a bitter, toxic resentment aimed at the woman sitting beside him, the woman whose incompetence in his mind had been the cause of it all. Annalise, on the other hand, would be staring out the small, scratched window at the endless, dark expanse of the Pacific Ocean. But she would not see the stars. She would be seeing the ghost of her mother. She would be hearing my words, not the legal threats, but the story of the heritage clause, the story of a mother's last desperate and heartbreaking attempt to teach her daughter a lesson. The lawyer in her would be calculating the scale of the financial devastation. But the daughter in her would be grappling with a much larger, much more terrifying debt, the moral bankruptcy of her own soul. The humiliation for him was financial. For her, it was existential. Sometime during the flight, a flight attendant would come by a cheerful, exhausted young woman asking if they wanted a drink. And in that moment, the sheer crushing weight of their new reality would hit them. They could no longer afford the life they believed was their birthright. The flight back was not a journey home. It was a descent, a long, slow, and agonizing fall back to earth. And I, in my quiet workshop, simply listened to the ticking of the clocks, knowing that with every second that passed, they were falling right back into my world. She came to me not in the bright, arrogant light of day, but in the long, creeping shadows of a Tuesday evening. There was no roaring sports car in the driveway, only the quiet click of a taxi door closing at the end of the street. I was in my workshop listening to the quiet, rhythmic ticking of the clocks when I saw her through the window. A solitary figure walking up my driveway, her steps slow, hesitant, almost fearful. It was Serena. But it was not the same woman who had left my house 2 weeks ago full of righteous, selfish anger. That woman was gone. This woman was a ghost, a pale, diminished creature, her shoulders slumped, her expensive clothes looking like a costume she had forgotten to take off. She did not come to the front door. She came to the side door of the workshop as if she no longer felt she had the right to enter the main house. She stood there for a long moment, her hand raised, hesitating before she finally gave a soft, timid knock that was barely audible over the sound of the clocks. I did not get up immediately. I let her wait. I let her stand on the other side of that door in the gathering darkness and contemplate the new geography of our relationship. She was no longer the queen. She was a supplicant at a closed gate. Finally, I went to the door and opened it. She flinched as if she were expecting a blow. Her face was pale. Her eyes were red-rimmed and hollow. She had not been sleeping. She had been living inside the terror my wife had so brilliantly designed for her. "Dad," she whispered the word, a raw, broken thing. Can I talk to you?" I did not invite her in. I simply stepped aside, a silent, non-committal gesture. She walked into the workshop, my sanctuary, and she seemed to shrink in the small space. She looked around at the tools, at the clocks, at the quiet, orderly world of my life, as if she were seeing it for the first time. "I'm sorry," she began, the words a frantic, desperate rush. "I am so sorry. I didn't know. I swear to you I didn't know about the clause about the patent. It was just a watch, Dad. I swear that's all I thought it was." She was a lawyer, and she was making her first desperate plea, a plea of ignorance. It was a weak defense, and we both knew it. "You knew what it was to me," I said, and my voice was not angry. It was just quiet, a simple statement of a simple fact. "I know," she cried, and the tears, the real hot tears of desperation, began to fall. "I know, and it was a terrible, horrible thing to do, but I was desperate. Chad, the trip. I made a mistake, a terrible, life-ruining mistake. But please, Daddy, please, you have to stop this." She took a step towards me, her hands outstretched in a gesture of supplication. "You have to call off the lawyers. The letter, the numbers. It's insane. It will ruin me. It will destroy the company. Mom's company. Please, you can't let that happen. Have mercy." Mercy. It was a word she had not understood when she had sold her mother's promise for a plane ticket. Now it was the only word left in her vocabulary. I looked at her, at my daughter weeping in the middle of my workshop, and I felt a profound and terrible stillness. "Mercy," I said, testing the word. "Mercy is a gift, Serena. It is not a thing you can demand when your own bad choices have cornered you." "But it was a mistake," she wailed. "It was one stupid mistake." "No," I said, and my voice was a cold, hard, and final truth. "It was not a mistake. It was a choice. You chose a vacation over a memory. You chose your husband's greed over your mother's legacy. You chose the price of a thing over its value. And now you must live with the consequences of that choice. This is not my doing, Serena. This is yours and your mother's. This is her final, most important, and most painful lesson, and I will not interfere with it." I turned my back on her then and returned to my workbench. I picked up a tiny, delicate gear with a pair of tweezers, my hand perfectly steady. The conversation was over. The plea had been denied. All that was left was the quiet, relentless, and unforgiving ticking of the clock. My daughter's plea for mercy was a desperate, ugly sound in the quiet of my workshop. It was the last desperate gambit of a player who has just realized they have been checkmated. She knelt on the floor, a broken, weeping figure, her hands outstretched, begging me to undo the consequences of her own choices. She was appealing to the father, the man she had called useless, hoping that a few well-timed tears could erase the profound and total disrespect she had shown me and her mother's memory. I did not move. I did not speak. I simply watched her, and I felt nothing. The father she was appealing to was a ghost. He had died in my study 2 weeks ago, murdered by her own casual, cruel words. The man who stood before her now was someone else. He was a watchmaker, an engineer, a man who understood that a system once broken cannot be fixed with tears. "Please, Daddy," she sobbed the word, a desperate, pathetic attempt to re-establish a bond she herself had severed. "Have mercy. I made a mistake." I looked down at her, at this stranger on my floor, and I finally spoke. My voice was not angry. It was not emotional. It was the quiet, calm, and utterly final voice of a man explaining a fundamental law of physics. "Mercy," I said, and the word tasted strange in my mouth. "That is an interesting concept, Serena." I walked over to my workbench and picked up the old yellowed contract, the one my wife had so brilliantly designed. I held it up. "I have read this document a dozen times in the last few days," I said, my voice as calm and steady as the ticking of a clock. "I have read every clause, every subsection, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that the word mercy does not appear anywhere in this contract." Her head snapped up, her tear-streaked face a mask of confusion. She had been expecting an emotional response, a negotiation of feelings. I was giving her a legal analysis. "This is not a family disagreement anymore, Serena." I continued, my voice a quiet, relentless lecture. "You made it a business transaction the moment you walked into Abe's timepieces and sold a corporate asset for cash. You have now triggered a clause in a legally binding contract. That is all. It is a simple, straightforward, and deeply impersonal matter of cause and effect. I placed the contract back on the workbench. Your mother was a brilliant businesswoman, I said. She did not build her empire on mercy. She built it on the integrity of a contract, on the absolute certainty that a deal once made must be honored. And the deal was very simple. The company could use my invention for $1 a year in exchange for the utmost respect of our shared legacy. I looked at her, my eyes as cold and hard as the jewels in a watch movement. You have failed to show respect, therefore you have breached the contract. The consequence of that breach is not a matter for emotional debate. It is a matter of legal and financial restitution. You did not want mercy when you told me to go die somewhere else. You did not want mercy when you sold your mother's promise for a plane ticket to Bali. You wanted the money. And now, I said, my voice dropping to a final quiet verdict, so do I. Mercy is not a clause in this contract, Serena, and our relationship is now governed by nothing else. I turned my back on her then and returned to my stool at the workbench. I picked up a tiny, delicate gear with a pair of tweezers, my hand perfectly steady. The conversation was over. The plea had been denied. All that was left was the quiet, relentless, and unforgiving ticking of the clock. I turned my back on her, a final, definitive gesture. The sound of her weeping, a raw, ugly sound in the quiet sanctuary of my workshop, did not move me. I returned to my stool at the workbench, picked up a tiny, delicate gear with a pair of tweezers, and held it to the light, my hand perfectly steady. The conversation was over. The plea for mercy had been denied. All that was left was the quiet, relentless, and unforgiving ticking of the clock. She could have left then. She could have walked out the door back to her ruined husband and the smoldering ashes of her life. But she did not. After a long, long time, the sobbing subsided, replaced by a series of small, hitching, exhausted breaths. "What do you want?" she whispered, her voice a raw, broken thing barely audible over the sound of the clocks. It was not a question of defiance. It was a question of surrender. The first honest question she had asked me in years. I did not turn around. I kept my back to her, my attention focused on the tiny, intricate machine on the felt before me. "Want?" I repeated the word, tasting strange. "I do not want anything, Serena. This is not about what I want. This is about the terms of the new agreement. The old one is broken. If you wish to build a new one, these are the conditions." I spoke to the room, not to her. I was a lawyer dictating the terms of a contract to a stenographer. Condition 1, I began, my voice as cold and precise as the tools on my bench. "Chad, he is to have no part in this. He will resign from any and all positions, formal or informal, at Viridian Dynamics. He will divest himself of any shares he holds in his own name. He will have no contact with any employee of the company. He is to be excised completely and permanently. This is not negotiable." I heard a small, sharp intake of breath behind me. "He's my husband," she whispered. "He was your business partner in an act of fraud," I corrected her, my voice unyielding. "And in this new company there is no room for him. He is a cancer, and you will remove him, or this conversation is over." The silence stretched. It was her first test, her first choice, her husband or her mother's legacy. "Okay," she finally whispered the word, a tiny, almost inaudible sound of surrender. "Condition 2, I continued, my voice a relentless, steady rhythm. "You will remain as the acting CEO of the company. In title." I let that small, cruel word hang in the air. "In practice, however, you will be my apprentice. Every major decision, every budget, every hire, every product launch will require my final written approval. I will exercise my voting rights on every single matter before the board. You will have a beautiful office and an impressive title, but you will have no real power, not until you have earned it. You will learn this company from the ground up. You will learn the science. You will learn the ethics. You will learn the history. You will learn the work, my work, your mother's work." I finally turned on my stool to face her. She was still on the floor, a broken figure in the half-light of the workshop. "I am not offering you a kingdom, Serena," I said, my voice quiet but carrying the weight of a final, unappealable verdict. "I am offering you a long, difficult, and deeply humiliating apprenticeship. It is the only path back. It is the only way to save your mother's company from the legal storm that is about to destroy it." I looked at her. My daughter, my enemy, my last and most difficult project. "Those are the terms," I said. "Accept them, and the lawyers will stand down. Reject them, and they will burn your world to the ground by Friday." The choice is yours. 6 months. In the life of a company, it is a fiscal quarter. In the life of a man, it is the turning of a season. In the life of my daughter, it was the end of a world. The first casualty of the new regime was predictably Chad. I did not have to be there to see his departure. I could construct the scene in my mind with the cold, clear logic of an engineer. He would have lasted 2 weeks, perhaps 3, in that grand, silent house, a king with no subjects and no money. He was a creature of momentum, of loud restaurants and fast cars. The quiet, the shame, the profound and utter impotence of his new situation would have been a poison to him. His marriage to my daughter had been a business merger, and the primary asset, her inheritance, had just been revealed to be a catastrophic liability. And so he divested. He would have packed his expensive, now unaffordable suits, and he would have left not with a roar of anger, but with the quiet, sneering contempt of a man who was abandoning a bad investment. He was a parasite, and the host was no longer profitable. Serena did not call me to tell me he was gone. I learned of it from Arthur Vance, my lawyer, who was monitoring the situation with a quiet professional vigilance. She was alone now, the sole titular head of a $100 million company she did not control, living in a house she could no longer afford, with no husband, no friends, and a father who was now, for all intents and purposes, her new boss. And she was failing. The reports I got from Arthur, who got his information from the loyal board members still inside the company, were a catalog of predictable disasters. Serena, a lawyer by training and a socialite by ambition, had no idea how to run a complex biotech firm. She tried to do what she knew. She tried to apply the logic of a luxury brand to a company built on science. She approved a massive, expensive new marketing campaign full of glossy photos and meaningless slogans without understanding the product's 18-month research and development cycle. She tried to do what Chad would have done. She tried to bully a key supplier on price, and in her arrogance she lost a contract that had taken my wife 10 years to build. She made mistakes, small, stupid, and incredibly expensive mistakes. She was a woman playing dress-up in her mother's CEO chair, and the clothes were 1,000 sizes too big. The board members, my old friends, were in a state of quiet professional panic. They would call me, their voices a low murmur of concern. "She's going to run it into the ground, Elias. Eleanor Vance, our CFO, told me one night. We have to do something." "No," I had replied, my voice calm, resolute. "We do nothing. She has to do this herself. Let her fail. Let her feel the full weight of her own incompetence." It was a cruel lesson, but it was the only one she would understand. And then about 3 months in, the reports began to change. The mistakes were still happening, but they were smaller, less frequent. Arthur told me that she had started staying late. Not in her mother's grand corner office, but down in the company library, a small dusty room filled with scientific journals and my old lab notes. She was reading, she was studying, she began asking the senior scientists questions, not about profits, but about processes. She was for the first time in her entire privileged life doing the homework. She was not learning to be a CEO. She was learning to be a student. She was still failing, but now she was failing upwards. She was learning. And I, in my quiet workshop, surrounded by the patient, ticking hearts of 100 beautiful machines, simply waited. I am a patient man. I know that a good machine, a broken machine, takes time to repair. The reports from Eris Thorne were a steady clinical drip of data. My daughter was working, she was struggling, but she was not quitting. For 3 months I stayed away. This part of her education had to be a solitary one. She had to learn to stand on her own in the ruins of her old life before she could learn to build a new one. But I knew from my years of managing research teams that there is a point where struggle becomes counterproductive. She was learning the what of the work, the tedious, repetitive tasks. She still had no understanding of the why. So one Saturday morning I made a call, not to her, but to the head of security at Viridian Dynamics. That Saturday, I did not go to my hotel room. I went to the company headquarters. I let myself into the silent, empty building and went to the top floor, to the executive wing. I went to her mother's office. It had been kept exactly as she had left it, a perfect silent museum of her life. I sat in one of the visitors' chairs, not in her CEO's chair, and I waited. At precisely 10 o'clock, I sent Serena a text. "Be in your mother's office in 30 minutes. It was not a request. It was a summons. She arrived in 25 minutes, looking nervous, her lab coat looking out of place in the expensive corporate environment. "Dad," she asked, her voice a hesitant whisper. "What is this? This," I said, my voice quiet, "is your first real lesson." I did not ask her to sit. I walked over to the large built-in bookshelf that housed her mother's business awards, and I pressed a hidden switch. A section of the bookshelf swung inward, revealing a small, climate-controlled safe. From it, I took a single framed object. It was a cocktail napkin, old and faded, covered in my own frantic, barely legible handwriting and a series of complex diagrams. "Do you know what this is?" I asked her. She shook her head. "This is Viridian Dynamics," I said. "This is the napkin from the bar where I first figured out the core mechanism for patent 5123456. This is the beginning of everything. Your mother framed it and kept it here not as a trophy, but as a reminder." I placed the napkin on her mother's desk. "Your mother was a genius," I began. "But her genius was not in science, it was in philosophy. Her entire business philosophy was built on a single, simple principle." I walked over to the large whiteboard that still held the faint ghosts of her last strategic plan. I picked up a dry erase marker. "She always said, 'We do not sell products, Elias. We solve problems.'" She saw the world not as a marketplace of consumers, but as a landscape of human problems waiting for an elegant scientific solution. The money, she always said, was just a byproduct of solving the problem correctly. I looked at my daughter, the lawyer, the woman who had tried to solve a cash flow problem by selling a sacred object. "You and your husband saw the company as a machine for generating cash. Your mother saw it as a machine for solving problems. That is why she was a builder and he was a parasite. That is the first lesson." These became our Saturdays. We would meet in her mother's office, a strange, haunted classroom. I would pull a file from the archives, an old project, a difficult contract. I would not give her the answers. I would show her the problem. And I would ask her, "How would your mother have solved this?" At first, her answers were clumsy, transactional, rooted in the world of profit and loss she had learned from Grant. But slowly, painstakingly, she began to change. She started to see the system. She started to see the philosophy. She started to think not like a lawyer, but like a founder. The why behind the what. She was no longer just cleaning the beakers. She was beginning to understand the beautiful, powerful, and world-changing purpose of the work they were meant for. The real change did not happen during our Saturday lessons. Those were just lectures, a forced curriculum. The real change, the one that mattered, happened in the quiet, lonely hours in between. It happened down in the basement of the company, in the dusty, forgotten archive room where Eris Thorne had sent her to organize the company's past. I did not see it happen, but I can reconstruct it because I know the materials she was working with. She would have been surrounded by a graveyard of dead ideas, of failed experiments, of projects that had cost millions and had yielded nothing. To her, a woman who had only ever known the glittering end result of success, this would have been a foreign and deeply depressing landscape. For weeks, it was just a job. A tedious, soul-crushing task of scanning old, brittle lab notes and creating a digital catalog. She would have seen my name and her mother's on hundreds of documents, the ghosts of our younger, more hopeful selves. She would have read the notes from the Chimera project, the one that had almost bankrupted us in the early days, and she would have seen it, I am sure, as just another failure, another example of our reckless, unbusinesslike passion. But Serena was a lawyer, and a good lawyer, no matter how morally compromised, has one essential skill: the ability to see a pattern in a sea of seemingly unrelated facts. As she worked, she would have started to see not just a series of individual failures, but a process, a relentless, brilliant, and deeply creative process of trial and error. She would see an idea from a failed project in 1992 suddenly reappear in a successful one in 1998. She would see how a chemical compound we had abandoned for one purpose was later modified and used for something completely different. She was not just archiving files. She was for the first time witnessing the very act of creation. She was seeing the machine, not just the product. She was seeing the work. The moment of revelation, I believe, would have come on a Tuesday afternoon. She would have been working on the files for my foundational patent, the one that had started it all. She would have been scanning my original lab notes, the frantic, coffee-stained pages filled with my almost illegible handwriting and my complex hand-drawn diagrams. And for the first time, she would not just be seeing a historical document, she would be seeing the thought process. She would see the failures, the dead ends, the moment of despair, and then the sudden, brilliant, world-changing breakthrough. She would be seeing the birth of an idea. And then she would have cross-referenced that patent with the company's financial records. She would see that this one single idea, born in a garage 30 years ago, was still to this day responsible for over 60% of Viridian Dynamics' annual revenue. It was a single gear that was turning the entire multi-billion-dollar machine. In that moment, in that quiet, dusty archive room surrounded by the ghosts of her parents' labor, she would have finally, truly understood. Her father, the useless old man she had discarded, was not just a relic. He was the engine. He was the source code. The respect she felt in that moment would not have been the respect of a daughter for a father. It would have been the cold, hard, and deeply profound respect of a lawyer for a brilliant contract of an investor for a priceless asset. It was the first real and most important moment of her education. I knew it had happened, not because she told me, but because the questions she asked me on the following Saturday were different. She did not ask about business. She did not ask about money. She came into her mother's office, sat down, and with a quiet, humble, and utterly genuine curiosity, she asked, "Dad, can you explain to me the principle of the micro-actuator?" And I, for the first time, began to teach my daughter not with a sense of obligation, but with a flicker of something I had thought was lost forever, a flicker of hope. The Saturdays became our new strange and fragile routine. Our conversations were a delicate dance on a minefield of unspoken history, but we were learning the steps. We spoke of science, of systems, of the work. We never spoke of the past or of the future. We simply existed in the difficult, constructive present. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, I was in my workshop restoring an old naval chronometer when a car I did not recognize pulled into my driveway. It was a modest, second-hand sedan, the kind a person buys for reliability, not for status. It was Serena's car. She got out dressed not in her lab coat, but in a simple professional dress. She was holding a small square box in her hands. She came to the workshop door and knocked a quiet, respectful sound that was now a part of our new language. I let her in. She did not speak. She simply walked to the center of the room and held out the box. It was a small green leather-bound box with a golden crown embossed on the top. A Rolex box. My heart, a quiet, steady machine, seemed to skip a beat. I did not take it from her immediately. I simply looked at it, then at her. Her face was pale, her expression a mixture of fear and hope and a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. Slowly I wiped my hands on a clean cloth and took the box from her. It was heavy, real. I opened the lid, and there it was, lying on the cream-colored velvet, its steel and gold gleaming under the light of my workbench lamp. Her mother's watch. It was not a ghost. It was not a memory. It was here. My hands. The hands of a watchmaker reached in and lifted it from the box. It felt cool and solid and real. I turned it over in my palm. I ran my thumb over the smooth, worn links of the bracelet. I brought it to my ear, and I heard it. The quiet, perfect, and utterly impossible sound of its tiny mechanical heart beating at a steady 28,800 vibrations per hour. It was alive. How? I whispered, my voice a raw, hoarse thing I did not recognize. "I sold the car, Dad," she said, her voice a quiet, simple statement of fact. "The Mercedes, and my jewelry, the pieces Grant bought me. It was almost enough. I've been paying Mr. Cohen the rest in installments from my salary for the last 3 months. I made the last payment this morning." I looked at her, at my daughter, and for the first time I saw the true cost of her education. It was not measured in tuition, but in the sacrifice of the last glittering vestiges of her old, empty life. She had traded the symbols of her prison for the key to her redemption. She had done the work. She had paid the debt. Not the financial debt to me, but the moral debt to her mother. She stood there waiting for my verdict. "I'm sorry," she whispered, and the words were not the desperate, panicked sobs from my hotel room. They were quiet, they were simple, and they were the truest words she had ever spoken. I did not tell her that I forgave her. Forgiveness was a mountain we had not yet begun to climb. Instead, I gave her the one thing I knew she had truly earned. I gave her the truth. "It was never about the money, Serena," I said, my voice quiet. "It was about the work. And this," I said, holding up the watch, this beautiful, impossible thing she had brought back from the dead, "this was good work. I did not put it back in the drawer. I did not put it on my own wrist. I placed it gently on the green felt of my workbench beside the tools of my trade. It was no longer just a memory of my wife. It was now a testament to my daughter. It was not a repair, but it was a beginning." The box sat on the green felt of my workbench, a small, quiet, and impossibly heavy object. It was a simple green leather Rolex box, but in the quiet of my workshop, it felt like a church relic, a thing of profound, and terrible significance. Serena stood before me, her hands clasped in front of her, a defendant who has just presented her final desperate piece of evidence. She did not speak. She simply waited for my verdict. I did not rush. I let the silence stretch, a silence filled with the ghosts of 50 years of love and 6 months of profound soul-crushing pain. I looked at my daughter, the stranger in a simple dress, and I saw not the arrogant heiress who had discarded me, not the weeping, desperate woman from my hotel room, but someone new. Someone I did not yet know. Slowly, I reached out and opened the box. The lid lifted with a soft, satisfying sigh. And there it was, lying on the cream-colored velvet, its steel and gold catching the bright, clean light of my workbench lamp. Her mother's watch. It was not a ghost. It was not a memory. It was here. My hands, the hands of a watchmaker. A man who has spent a lifetime in the pursuit of mechanical perfection, trembled slightly as I lifted it from its velvet bed. It felt cool and solid and real. It was heavier than I remembered, weighted now with the story of its loss and its return. I turned it over in my palm. I ran my thumb over the smooth, worn links of the bracelet, a bracelet that still held the faint, ghostly impression of my wife's wrist. I brought it to my ear and I heard it. The quiet, perfect, and utterly impossible sound of its tiny mechanical heart beating at a steady 28,800 vibrations per hour. It was alive. How? I whispered, my voice, a raw, hoarse thing I did not recognize. I sold the car, Dad, she said, her voice a quiet, simple statement of fact. The Mercedes. And my jewelry. The pieces Grant bought me. It was almost enough. I've been paying Mr. Cohen the rest in installments from my salary for the last 3 months. I made the last payment this morning. I looked at her, at my daughter, and for the first time I saw the true cost of her education. It was not measured in tuition, but in the painful, systematic sacrifice of the last glittering vestiges of her old, empty life. She had traded the symbols of her prison, the flashy car, the meaningless jewelry for the key to her redemption. She had done the work. Not the work in the lab, but the harder, more painful work of penance. She had paid the debt. Not the financial debt to me, but the moral debt to her mother. She stood there waiting. She had presented her case. She had offered her restitution. And now she waited for my judgment. "I'm sorry," she whispered, and the words were not the desperate, panicked sobs from my hotel room. They were not a negotiation tactic. They were quiet. They were simple. And they were the truest, most honest words she had ever spoken in her entire life. And I, in that moment, had a choice. The father in me, the ghost I thought had been long buried, wanted to pull her into my arms to tell her it was okay to wipe away her tears and tell her she was forgiven. But the watchmaker, the engineer, the man who had spent the last 6 months teaching her the hard, unforgiving lessons of cause and effect, knew that it was not that simple. A broken machine cannot be fixed with a simple word. It must be rebuilt piece by piece. I did not tell her that I forgave her. Forgiveness was a mountain we had not yet begun to climb. Instead, I gave her the one thing I knew she had truly, finally earned. I gave her the truth. "It was never about the money, Serena," I said, my voice quiet. "It was about the work. And this," I said, holding up the watch, "this beautiful, impossible thing she had brought back from the dead, this was good work." It was not forgiveness. It was not an embrace, but it was an acknowledgement. It was a foundation, a single, solid, and perfectly calibrated place to begin to build again. The watch sat on the green felt of my workbench, a small, quiet, and impossibly heavy object. Serena stood before me, a defendant who had just presented her final, desperate piece of evidence. She waited for my verdict. Slowly I reached out and opened the green leather box. And there it was, lying on the cream-colored velvet, its steel and gold catching the bright, clean light of my workbench lamp. Her mother's watch. My hands trembled slightly as I lifted it from its velvet bed. It felt cool and solid and real. I brought it to my ear and I heard it, the quiet, perfect, and utterly impossible sound of its tiny mechanical heart beating at a steady 28,800 vibrations per hour. It was alive. "How?" I whispered, my voice a raw, hoarse thing. "I sold the car, Dad." she said, her voice a quiet, simple statement of fact. The Mercedes. And my jewelry. The pieces Grant bought me. It was almost enough. I've been paying Mr. Cohen the rest in installments from my salary for the last 3 months. I made the last payment this morning. I looked at my daughter, and I saw the true cost of her education. She had traded the symbols of her prison for the key to her redemption. She had done the work. Not the work in the lab, but the harder, more painful work of penance. "I'm sorry," she whispered. And the words were not a negotiation tactic. They were quiet, they were simple, and they were the truest, most honest words she had ever spoken. I did not tell her that I forgave her. Forgiveness was a mountain we had not yet begun to climb. Instead, I gave her the one thing I knew she had truly earned. I gave her the truth. "This," I said, holding up the watch, "this beautiful, impossible thing she had brought back from the dead, was good work." I did not put it back in the drawer. I did not put it on my own wrist. I placed it gently on the workbench, and then I turned to a set of new crisp documents that my lawyer had delivered that morning. "The return of this watch," I said, my voice shifting, becoming the voice of the CEO once more, "satisfies one part of the breach. It restores the integrity of the heritage clause, but it does not solve the larger problem. The old contract is still broken. We need a new one." I slid a document across the workbench towards her. It was a new licensing agreement. "This is the new contract between me, the patent holder, and Viridian Dynamics, the company you now run," I said. She looked at it, her face pale with a new, uncertain fear. She was probably expecting some new draconian set of terms. She flipped to the section on compensation. Her eyes went wide. 10%, she whispered. 10% of net profits, Dad, that's tens of millions of dollars a year. The company can't afford that." "The company can and will afford it," I said simply. "But the money is not for me." I slid a second document across the bench. It was the charter for a new, non-profit foundation. "Read the next clause," I said. She read it, her lips moving silently. "All royalties and payments derived from this licensing agreement shall be paid directly and in perpetuity to the Lena Vance Foundation for Women in Business." She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a dawning, uncomprehending wonder. "The Lena Vance Foundation," I explained, my voice quiet, "will provide seed capital mentorship and support for young female entrepreneurs, women like your mother, who have a brilliant idea but lack the resources to build it. The profits from our first great idea will now be the foundation for 1,000 new ones." The brilliance of my wife's final ultimate plan was now complete. She had not just created a lesson for our daughter, she had created a legacy that would echo for generations. "A legacy is not a treasure chest you inherit, Serena," I said, my voice now a quiet final lecture. "It is a tool. It is a responsibility. Your mother's work, my work. It was never about giving you a life of luxury. It was about creating a machine that could do good in the world. You broke the machine. Now you will spend the rest of your life running it, not for your own benefit, but for the benefit of women you will never even meet." I pushed a pen across the workbench. "The company your mother and I built is bleeding out," I said, echoing my lawyer's words. "My signature is the only thing in the world that can stop it, but it is your signature on this new contract that will give it a new heart, a new purpose." I looked at my daughter, my brilliant, broken, and now finally rebuilding daughter. "The work begins now," I said. "Sign the papers." And as she reached for the pen, her hand no longer trembling, I knew that my wife's true legacy was not in the watch or the patent or the money. It was here in this moment. In the difficult, painful, and beautiful act of a daughter, finally, truly, and with a clear and sober mind, choosing to earn her own name. The pen scratched softly against the heavy, watermarked paper, the only sound in the quiet, ticking sanctuary of my workshop. Serena finished her signature with a final, decisive stroke. It was not the looping, arrogant signature of an heiress. It was the simple, unadorned signature of a woman signing a contract, a worker. She pushed the document back across the workbench towards me. Her part was done. She had signed away 10% of her company's future profits. She had accepted the terms. She waited, her face pale, her expression unreadable, for my final word. I did not look at the contract immediately. My eyes were on the watch, her mother's watch. It sat between us on the green felt, its quiet, steady heartbeat a silent witness to this final, profound transaction. "When your mother and I started the company," I began, my voice a quiet, reflective murmur, "we never talked about getting rich. We talked about solving problems. The science was the point. The work was the point. The money, I said finally looking up at her, was just a byproduct, a happy accident. It was the score, not the game. I gestured to the two contracts sitting side by side on the bench, the old yellowed one from 1988 and the new crisp one she had just signed. That first contract, I said, the $1 contract, was a promise. It was your mother's way of saying that the integrity of the work was more valuable than any amount of money. It was a test of character built into the foundation of our company, a test that for a time our family failed. I could see a flicker of the old shame in her eyes, but she did not look away. This new contract, I continued, my voice calm, is not a punishment, Serena. It is a correction. It is a recalibration of the entire machine. I slid the charter for the new foundation towards her. The Lena Vance Foundation for Women in Business. 10% of all profits from this day forward will go to them. To help other women, women like your mother who have a brilliant idea but no resources. To give them the start that we had to fight so hard for. She stared at the name, her mother's name now, the title of a legacy that had nothing to do with her own inheritance. And in that moment I think she finally truly understood. Your mother's legacy was never the $42 million, Serena, I said, delivering the final, most important lesson of her long, painful education. That was just the raw material. The legacy was not a gift for you to spend. It is a tool, a powerful wealth-generating machine that she and I built. And the purpose of a tool is not to be admired, it is to be used, to build things. I stood up and walked to the door of my workshop, looking out at the quiet, unassuming world. You will run the company. I said, my back to her. You will make it profitable. You will be very successful. But you will not do it for a new car or a bigger house or a vacation in Bali. You will do it for them. For the women you will never meet. Your success is no longer your own. It is now and forever tied to the success of others. Every dollar of profit you make is a dollar that can launch another woman's dream. That is the work. That is the job. That is the legacy. I turned to face her one last time. She was no longer a child. She was no longer a victim. She was a woman with a purpose, a difficult, demanding, and profoundly meaningful purpose. The lesson was over. The apprenticeship was complete. Now, I said, my voice quiet but carrying the full, unshakable weight of a final paternal command, go to work. She looked at me for a long moment, her eyes clear for the first time in a long time. She did not cry. She did not say thank you. She simply gave a single slow and profound nod, a nod of understanding, a nod of acceptance. Then she turned and walked out of my workshop, not as a disgraced heiress, but as the CEO of her mother's company, a woman who finally, after all this time, had a real job to do. The quiet in my workshop is a different kind of quiet now. It is not the silence of grief. It is not the silence of a man waiting for a war to begin. It is the full, rich, and deeply satisfying silence of a man at work. A year has passed. The house is sold. The foundation is established. The machine my wife and I built is now finally doing the work it was always meant to do. My days are my own again, measured not in anger or sadness, but in the steady rhythmic ticking of 100 beautiful machines. On the workbench before me is not an old watch I am restoring. It is a new one, a project of my own design. A complex, beautiful, and entirely new movement taking shape under my hands piece by tiny, intricate piece. The work is slow. It requires patience. It requires a steady hand. It is good work. The door to the workshop opens softly. Serena stands there not in a lab coat, not in a designer dress, but in simple, comfortable clothes. She is holding 2 cups of coffee. She does not speak. She simply places 1 cup on the corner of my workbench, a quiet, respectful distance from my work, and takes a seat on the stool on the other side of the room. This is our new ritual. We do not talk about the past. The past is a country we have both left behind. Instead, we talk about the work. She tells me about a setback in the clinical trials for her new dermatological cream. A problem with the emulsion stability at high temperatures. I listen. I do not give her the answer. I simply ask her a question. What was the core principle of the original protein's instability? Serena. She is quiet for a long time, thinking. It was a thermodynamic problem, she says finally, her eyes lighting up with a new, hard-won understanding. Of course, I've been looking at the chemistry. I need to be looking at the physics. She stands up. Thank you, Dad. She says the word dad, still a little bit foreign, a little bit fragile in the air between us. I know what to do now. She leaves as quietly as she came. I look at the coffee she has left for me. It is hot and strong and exactly the way I like it. On a small velvet stand on the far corner of my bench, her mother's Rolex rests its quiet, steady heartbeat, a silent guardian of this new, fragile piece. Our relationship is not what it was. The easy warmth of the past is gone forever. But what has been built in its place is something new, something quieter, something built not on the shifting sands of obligation and inheritance, but on the solid bedrock of mutual respect for the work. A shared understanding that the most beautiful, most valuable things in this world are not the things we are given, but the things we have the patience and the courage to build ourselves. My wife taught me that the smallest gear can turn the largest wheel. My daughter taught me that some people only see the gold case of a watch and never the intricate, brilliant machine inside. True value is rarely on the surface. It is hidden in the fine print of a contract, in the number on a patent, in the quiet dignity of a lifetime's work. A legacy isn't just the treasure you leave behind. It's the wisdom to know what's truly priceless, a lesson I had to teach when my heart was already broken. What about you? What do you think is more valuable, the price of a thing or the story behind it? I'd love to read your thoughts in the comments below. If you want to hear more stories like this, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for listening.